Picture a candlelit scriptorium in the quiet hours before dawn, where a lone monk carefully inks lines onto parchment by the faint, flickering glow. Outside, the world is still shrouded in mist and superstition, an age of castles, crusades, and whispered legends. We often think of the medieval period as a time defined by what we know: knights in shining armor, grand cathedrals rising toward the heavens, the Black Death sweeping across continents. But just beyond the edges of our history books lie stories that have slipped through the cracks of time, mysteries so compelling and strange that they challenge everything we assume about this fascinating era. What secrets lie buried in the dusty pages of history, waiting just out of sight? For every famous battle or coronation, there are a dozen untold riddles, vanished villages, unexplained artifacts, encrypted manuscripts no one has ever fully decoded, and rumors of wonders that defy logical explanation. These are the forgotten mysteries of the medieval world, stories that tease our imagination and invite us to look closer, to question what we've been told, and to wonder about the truths that may still be hidden in plain sight. This was a time when the line between myth and reality was often blurred, where everyday life was punctuated by the miraculous and the inexplicable. Join me as we step into the shadows of the past and uncover 30 of history's most intriguing cold cases. Together, we'll traverse continents and centuries, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked deserts of the Middle East, in search of answers that have eluded historians for generations. You won't just hear about these puzzles, you'll feel the thrill of the hunt, the frustration of dead ends, and the electric spark of discovery when a new clue surfaces after hundreds of years. This is more than a list. It's an invitation to explore the edges of the known world and rediscover the awe and curiosity that define our shared human story. Are you ready to delve into the forgotten? Our journey into the forgotten begins with an object that is perhaps the ultimate historical puzzle, a book that refuses to give up its secrets. Imagine a 240-page codex bound in vellum, filled from edge to edge with a flowing, unknown script. This is the Voynich Manuscript, and it is unlike any other text on Earth. Its pages are a riot of baffling illustrations, delicate paintings of plants that have never been identified by any botanist, their roots and leaves seeming to belong to a world just beyond our own. There are intricate diagrams of celestial spheres populated by unfamiliar constellations, and perhaps most strangely, pages upon pages of tiny, naked women bathing together in a complex network of green, tubular pipes and pools of liquid. The text itself, written in an elegant hand, consists of over 170,000 characters, forming a language that has no known alphabet, no recognizable grammar, and no Rosetta Stone to provide a key. We know the book is genuinely old, with carbon dating placing its vellum somewhere between 1404 and 1438. It surfaced in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Prague, who reportedly purchased it for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, suggesting he believed it to be the work of the legendary 13th century friar and scientist Roger Bacon. From there, it passed through the hands of alchemists and collectors, eventually disappearing for centuries before being rediscovered in 1912 by a Polish book dealer named Wilfred Voynich, from whom it takes its name. And this is where the mystery deepens from curious to utterly compelling. The 20th century's greatest minds have attacked this book and been utterly defeated. Professors of linguistics, medieval historians, and even the top codebreakers from both world wars, the very same teams that cracked the infamous German Enigma cipher, turned their formidable intellects to the Voynich and failed completely. Not a single word, not one sentence has ever been conclusively translated. Theories about its origin and purpose are as plentiful as they are varied. Some believe it is a sophisticated hoax, an elaborate forgery designed to separate a wealthy patron from his money. Yet, the statistical analysis of the text reveals patterns consistent with a real, structured language, not random gibberish. Others propose it is a manual of forgotten herbal knowledge or a treatise on a lost form of proto-chemistry. There are those who argue it represents a visual representation of a psychedelic trip or is written in a constructed language meant only for a select few. The most tantalizing possibility is that it is the sole surviving example of a completely unknown language and worldview, a lone artifact from a culture that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only this beautifully illustrated, utterly incomprehensible cry across the centuries. It sits today in Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, a silent, stubborn monument to the fact that some stories, no matter how much we long to hear them, choose to remain whispers. But if the Voynich Manuscript represents an intellectual mystery, a puzzle of ink and vellum, our next enigma is one of flesh and blood, a story so strange it feels like it was ripped from the pages of a fantasy novel. Sometime during the reign of King Stephen, in the middle of the 12th century, the quiet village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, was the site of an event that defied all rational explanation. According to the chronicles of two respected 12th century historians, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, reapers working in the fields at harvest time made a shocking discovery. Emerging from one of the deep, ancient pits used to trap wolves from which the village gets its name, were two children, a boy and a girl. They were dressed in clothing of an unusual material and color, but that was not the most startling thing about them. Their skin from head to toe was a vivid, unmistakable shade of green. Terrified and speaking a language no one could recognize, the children were taken to the local lord, Sir Richard de Calne. They refused all food offered to them for days, seemingly on the verge of starvation, until someone brought in a harvest of fresh green beans. They devoured the beans ravenously, though it was noted they did not eat the pods themselves, seemingly unfamiliar with them. For a time, this strange green bean diet was all they would consume. Eventually, they began to accept other foods, and as their diet changed, a remarkable transformation occurred. Their green skin gradually faded to a more ordinary pinkish hue. Tragically, the boy soon grew sickly and passed away, but the girl survived, adapted to her new life, learned English, and was eventually baptized. Once she could communicate, she was able to tell her incredible story. She and her brother, she claimed, came from a land she called St. Martin's Land, a place of perpetual twilight where all the people were green and where the sun never shone, only a faint, hazy glow like the light just after sunset. She described this other world as existing on the other side of a wide, cavernous river, and one day, while tending their father's flocks, they heard a loud, ringing sound. They followed the noise into a cave, and after wandering in darkness for what felt like an age, they suddenly emerged, blinded by the intense brightness of the Suffolk sun, into the wolf pit where the reapers found them. The account is meticulously recorded by sober medieval scholars who presented it not as folklore but as a factual event. So what are we to make of the Green Children of Woolpit? The explanations are as varied as they are fascinating. Some lean into the supernatural, suggesting the children were visitors from a parallel dimension or even extraterrestrials, their green skin a result of a different biology or chemistry, and their disorientation a classic case of interdimensional travel shock. The girl's description of a twilight world could easily be interpreted as a planet orbiting a dim star or existing within a different realm of reality altogether. More grounded theories propose they were lost Flemish immigrants. During this period, Flemish weavers had been invited to England by King Stephen's predecessor, Henry I, but later faced persecution under Stephen. Suffolk had a significant Flemish population, and it's possible these children were orphans who fled into the dangerous marshland wilderness of the fens after their parents were killed. Their strange language would have been Flemish, their unusual clothing of foreign cut, the green complexion, potentially a severe form of chloroses or green sickness, a type of anemia often linked to malnutrition, which would fit their initial refusal of food and subsequent recovery on a proper diet. The perpetual twilight of their homeland could be a child's confused memory of the dark, foggy fens, and the loud ringing bell they followed could have been from a nearby abbey, calling them to safety they never truly found. Yet, even this rational theory doesn't perfectly fit, leaving just enough room for that tantalizing sliver of doubt, that wonder about whether the borders of our world are truly as fixed as we believe them to be. We leave the green fields of England behind now and travel east, deep into the heart of winter and into the reign of one of history's most formidable and fearsome rulers. Ivan IV of Russia, a man who earned his enduring nickname, the Terrible, through a brutal combination of paranoia, violent outbursts, and a tyrannical grip on power. But behind this facade of terror lay a mind of surprising depth and erudition. Ivan was a deeply complex figure, a Tsar who could order horrific massacres one day and compose highly sophisticated religious music the next. And it is this intellectual side of Ivan that fuels our next mystery, a tale not of green children or encrypted texts, but of a lost treasure of knowledge so vast it would dwarf the legendary Library of Alexandria. This is the story of the lost library of the Tsars, often called the Library of Ivan the Terrible. The seeds of this legend were planted decades before Ivan's birth with his grandfather, Ivan III. In 1472, he married Sophia Palaeologina, the niece of the last emperor of Byzantium. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, it sent a shockwave through Christendom, and Sophia arrived in Moscow not just as a bride, but as a living symbol of a fallen empire. And she did not come empty-handed. Her dowry was said to include something far more valuable than gold or jewels, the magnificent imperial library of the Byzantine emperors. This was a collection painstakingly assembled over centuries, containing priceless original manuscripts from ancient Greece and Rome, works of philosophy, science, history, and literature that were thought to have been lost forever during the Dark Ages. Think of the complete histories of Livy, the lost plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus, and perhaps even entire texts by Aristotle that no modern scholar has ever laid eyes on. This collection was rumored to be so vast that it required dozens of wagons to transport, and it was housed in the Kremlin's catacombs, a secret passed down from ruler to ruler. The legend truly ignites with Ivan the Terrible. As a highly educated man who loved books, he is said to have not only preserved this collection but greatly expanded it, adding rare volumes acquired from across Europe. He was known to be fluent in several languages and was reportedly an avid reader, often retreating into his private collection. But Ivan was also pathologically suspicious. As his reign grew more violent and his enemies, both real and imagined, multiplied, he grew terrified that his priceless knowledge would be stolen or destroyed. And so, according to the story, he ordered the entire library to be moved. The countless chests and crates containing the wisdom of the ancient world were secretly transported from the Kremlin and hidden away in a secure, unknown location, perhaps beneath the city of Moscow itself or within the fortified walls of the distant Alexandrov Kremlin, his personal retreat. The secret of its location died with him in 1584, taking one of history's greatest cultural treasures into the shadows. For centuries, the library has been the Holy Grail for Russian historians and archaeologists. There are tantalizing clues. In the 16th century, a visiting German Protestant pastor named Johann Wettmann claimed to have even seen a catalogue of the library's holdings, a document that has also since vanished. Countless searches have been launched from the time of Peter the Great to the Soviet era. Teams have used everything from shovels to ground-penetrating radar to scour the depths beneath the Kremlin, the Kitay-Gorod district, and other suspected sites. They have found hidden chambers, secret tunnels, and even other treasures, but never the library itself. The central question remains, is it a historical reality or a beautiful myth? Skeptics argue that if a collection of that immense size truly existed, some trace of it would have been found by now, or at the very least, more contemporary evidence would exist beyond second-hand accounts. They suggest the story may be a conflated memory of a smaller, more modest collection that was eventually dispersed or destroyed by fire. Yet the believers counter with a compelling point. Moscow is an ancient city built layer upon layer, its full subterranean world still largely unexplored and unmapped. The very nature of a secret deliberately kept by a paranoid autocrat means it was designed never to be found. The possibility that it rests somewhere deep beneath the modern metropolis, waiting for a chance encounter during a construction project, is a dream that has fueled imagination for generations. It represents the ultimate historical, what-if, a hidden key to the classical world that could rewrite chapters of history and reclaim lost masterpieces of human thought, all silently guarded by the ghost of a terrible Tsar. From the silent, buried knowledge of a paranoid Tsar, we now journey to a mystery that is anything but silent, an event defined by its terrible, relentless noise. The year is 1518. The place is Strasbourg, a bustling city in the Holy Roman Empire in what is now France. The month is July and the air is thick with summer heat. It begins not with a whisper but with a single, frantic movement. A woman named Frau Trophia steps into the street and begins to dance. There is no music, no celebration. Her movements are jerky, involuntary, a violent and compulsive jig that she seems powerless to stop. She dances for hours, then for days, exhausted, in agony, her feet bleeding, she still cannot cease. Within a week, she is not alone. Dozens have joined her, their bodies seized by the same irresistible compulsion. Within a month, the street is a chaotic, horrifying ballroom of over 400 people, all dancing themselves to the brink of death. This was the dancing plague of 1518, and it remains one of the most bizarre and frightening mass events in recorded history. The city's authorities, initially baffled, decided the best course of action was to lean into the mania. They built a large wooden stage in the horse market, hired musicians to play lively tunes, and even brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted moving, believing they needed to dance it out of their systems. This, of course, had the opposite effect. The constant music and enforced dancing only exacerbated the exhaustion. The dancers writhed and screamed in pain, their bodies breaking down under the immense strain. Contemporary reports describe them as being in a trance-like state, unaware of their surroundings, driven only by the terrible rhythm that possessed them. The end was often grim. Many dancers succumbed to heart attacks, strokes, or sheer physical collapse, their bodies giving out after days without rest or proper nourishment. Naturally, the people of the time scrambled for an explanation. Medieval medicine pointed to a phenomenon called hot blood, a theory that an imbalance of bodily humors could literally overheat the blood, causing a feverish madness that manifested in dancing. The Church saw it as a clear case of demonic possession or divine punishment, a curse cast upon the sinful citizens of Strasbourg. Some even blamed the wrath of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr who was ironically invoked as a protector against dancing maladies. But these explanations, born of superstition and limited science, only deepen the puzzle for us today. Modern scholars have proposed several compelling, if still debated, theories. The most prominent is mass psychogenic illness, formerly known as mass hysteria. This is a powerful phenomenon where extreme psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms in a group of people. To understand this, we must appreciate the context of Strasbourg in 1518. The region had been devastated by a series of terrible harvests, leading to extreme famine and crippling poverty. A wave of diseases had swept through the population, and the poor lived under the constant threat of starvation and death. The psychological pressure was immense. In such a state of collective, unbearable anxiety, a single person's breakdown, perhaps Frau Trophia's, could have acted as a psychological trigger, a release valve for the entire community's pent-up fear and despair. Their bodies, unable to process the trauma, acted it out in this terrifying kinetic frenzy. Another leading theory points to a physical cause, ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, a staple grain of the poor in medieval Europe. This fungus contains chemicals strikingly similar to LSD, a powerful hallucinogen. Ingesting bread made from infected rye can lead to a condition known as St. Anthony's fire, which causes violent muscle spasms, convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs, symptoms that could easily be interpreted as a frenzied dance. The hot, wet summer of 1518 would have been perfect conditions for ergot to flourish. Yet, this theory has its flaws. While ergotism can cause spasms, it also typically leads to gangrene and a painful restriction of blood flow, which doesn't perfectly align with the descriptions of weeks of continuous high-energy movement. Perhaps the truth lies in a terrifying combination of both. A population already weakened by famine and stress, their bread bowls laced with a mild psychoactive toxin that induced hallucinations and spasms, could have created the perfect storm for a mass psychogenic event. The few who initially began twitching from poisoned grain might have sparked a wave of psychological contagion that swept through a terrified and suggestible populace. The dancing plague of Strasbourg is not a lone incident. Similar, smaller events are recorded throughout medieval Europe, but the scale and intensity of the 1518 outbreak make it the most infamous. It stands as a stark and unsettling reminder of the profound and mysterious connection between the mind and the body, and a chilling example of how human beings, when pushed to the absolute edge of endurance, can break in ways we are still struggling to comprehend. We shift now from a mystery of mass psychology to one of cold, calculated power, a political thriller that has captivated England for over 5 centuries. It is a story of 2 young boys, a crown and a tower that became a prison. In the spring of 1483, the 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, were the 2 most watched and most vulnerable figures in the kingdom. Their father, the charismatic and powerful Edward IV, had died suddenly, leaving a vacuum of power that the English nobility, a fractious and ambitious bunch, were all too eager to fill. The backdrop to this drama was the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long, bloody civil war between the rival houses of Lancaster and York that had torn the country apart. The young king's ascension was supposed to herald a new period of Yorkist stability. Instead, it set the stage for one of history's most infamous disappearances. The key player in this tragedy was the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, initially appointed as Lord Protector to guide the young king until he came of age. Richard moved with shocking speed and ruthlessness. He had the boy's maternal relatives, the Woodville family, arrested or sidelined, claiming they were plotting against him. He then had the 2 princes brought from their residence to the Tower of London. While today we think of the Tower solely as a prison, it was also a royal palace and a traditional place for monarchs to await their coronation. So their arrival there was not immediately sinister. Edward V was preparing for his coronation, scheduled for the 22nd of June, but that ceremony never happened. Instead, Richard presented evidence to Parliament that his brother's marriage to the boy's mother was invalid, making the 2 princes illegitimate and therefore ineligible for the throne. On the 26th of June, an assembly of lords and commoners formally asked Richard to take the crown, which he did, becoming King Richard III. As for the princes, they were seen less and less frequently playing in the Tower Gardens, and then, by the end of the summer of 1483, they were not seen at all. They had vanished from sight and from history, leaving behind only a chilling question. The obvious and long-held assumption is that Richard III ordered their murders. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The boys were a constant threat to his new and precarious reign. As long as they lived, they were a rallying point for rebellion. Their existence undermined his entire claim to legitimacy. He controlled the Tower and everyone in it. For those who believe in his guilt, the case seems open and shut. But this is a mystery with a compelling counter-narrative, one that has given rise to centuries of passionate debate. Other suspects have been put forward by historians and partisans. One prime candidate is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Initially Richard's key ally in grabbing power, Buckingham later turned against him and led a failed rebellion. Did he have the boys killed without Richard's knowledge to destabilize the king and further his own ambitions? Or did he do it on Richard's orders and then use the act to later claim the moral high ground? Then there is the man who ultimately defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field 2 years later, Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. Henry's claim to the throne was exceedingly weak, relying on distant Lancastrian ancestry. His victory and marriage to the prince's older sister, Elizabeth of York, united the two warring houses and finally ended the Wars of the Roses. But for his reign to be secure, the rightful Yorkist heirs, the two princes, had to be gone. If they were already dead by Richard's hand, it was a political gift for Henry. But what if they weren't? Some theories suggest one or both princes survived Richard's reign, only for Henry to have them quietly disposed of after he took power. He had every bit as much motive as Richard, and his subsequent actions are telling. He never launched a genuine investigation into their fate, and he had the man who had been constable of the Tower during their imprisonment executed on a different pretext, a move that looked very much like tying up a loose end. The physical evidence in the case is as controversial as the theories. In 1674, during renovations to the Tower of London, workmen discovered a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase leading to the chapel in the White Tower. Inside were the small skeletons of two children. King Charles II, convinced these were the remains of the princes, had them interred in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, where they rest today. In 1933, the urn was opened and the bones were examined by scientists. Their conclusion was that the skeletons were of two children of the right ages and showed no obvious signs of cause of death, though the younger skeleton had a jaw that showed some possible signs of suffocation. However, the examination was far from conclusive, and the remains have never been subjected to modern DNA analysis, a decision that remains a point of intense debate. The Abbey has refused further testing, leaving this crucial piece of evidence frustratingly out of reach. The mystery of the princes in the Tower is more than a historical whodunit. It is the foundation of a great character assassination. William Shakespeare's famous play, written during the reign of Richard's Tudor successors, cemented his image as a scheming, physically deformed monster, a caricature that persisted for centuries. Modern societies, like the Richard III Society, have worked tirelessly to rehabilitate his image, arguing he was a progressive and effective administrator unfairly maligned by the winners who wrote the history. The truth is, we will likely never know for certain who gave the order. The case offers no smoking gun, only shadows and whispers. It remains the ultimate cold case, a story of innocence sacrificed on the altar of ambition, a dark stain on the history of the English crown that continues to provoke argument, investigation, and a deep, haunting fascination with the fate of two boys who were simply born too close to the throne. From the grim political machinations of the English throne, we now turn to a mystery of an entirely different nature, one not of blood and betrayal, but of faith, legend, and a search for divine power itself. This is the pursuit of the most coveted relic in all of Christendom, the Holy Grail. More than just a physical object, the Grail is an idea, a symbol that has captivated the medieval mind and beyond, representing the ultimate prize, a direct conduit to the divine, and a test of purity that only the most worthy could ever hope to pass. The Grail's journey into medieval legend is a fascinating tapestry woven from scripture, romance, and pure invention. Its biblical roots are surprisingly shallow. The Gospels mention a cup used at the Last Supper, but it is not given any special emphasis. The relic's legendary life truly begins with Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy disciple who provided his own tomb for the burial of Jesus. Early Christian traditions, particularly the apocryphal Acts of Pilate, expanded Joseph's story, suggesting he used the sacred cup to catch the blood of Christ at the crucifixion, thus infusing it with immense power. From here, the story leaps from history into high medieval romance. In the late 12th century, the French poet Chrétien de Troyes penned Percival, the story of the Grail, introducing the concept to the burgeoning Arthurian cycle. Here, it is not yet explicitly Christian, but a mysterious, luminous platter that sustains the wounded Fisher King. It was other authors like Robert de Boron who later definitively fused the Grail with Joseph of Arimathea's cup, creating the narrative we recognize today, of Joseph bringing the relic to Britain and it becoming the spiritual heart of King Arthur's realm, a goal for his knights that was less about conquest and more about spiritual awakening. This transformation of the Grail from a simple cup into a cosmic test of purity is what truly captured the medieval imagination. In a world saturated with relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, pieces of the crown of thorns, the Grail stood apart. It was unique. It was not a reminder of a saint's death, but a living symbol of Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. The Great Grail romances written in the 12th and 13th centuries, like the epic Quest del Saint Graal, presented it as the ultimate measure of a knight's worth. Strength and bravery were not enough. Only a soul free of sin, like the perfectly pure Sir Galahad, could ever truly achieve the Grail. This resonated deeply in an era where knighthood was struggling to find a moral code beyond mere violence, offering a new ideal, spiritual chivalry. The Grail quest became an allegory for the Christian soul's journey toward grace, a metaphor that made it far more powerful and enduring than any other artifact. But if the Grail was a real object, where could it possibly be? The Middle Ages were not short on answers, and several locations across Europe have staked a powerful claim. One of the most prominent is the Cathedral of Valencia in Spain. Here, in the chapel of the Holy Chalice, resides the so-called Santo Cáliz. This is a beautifully crafted agate cup dating to the 1st century BCE, mounted on a magnificent medieval gold and gemstone base. It has a documented history tracing back to the 11th century, when it was reportedly given to the cathedral by King Alfonso V of Aragon. Its proponents point to its undeniable antiquity and its long-standing veneration as powerful evidence. Skeptics, however, note that its historical trail only goes so far, and while it is a profoundly ancient and sacred vessel, conclusively linking it to the upper room in Jerusalem remains, like all things Grail-related, a matter of faith. Then there is Glastonbury in England, a place steeped in Arthurian myth like no other. The legend here is that Joseph of Arimathea himself, arriving in Britain, thrust his staff into the ground on Wiriol Hill, where it miraculously flowered into the Glastonbury thorn, a hawthorn tree that blooms twice a year around Christmas and Easter. He is then said to have hidden the Grail somewhere nearby, perhaps at the foot of the Tor, the mysterious terraced hill that dominates the landscape. The connection was powerfully bolstered in the late 12th century, when monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have discovered the tombs of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, creating a permanent link between the location and the legend. For many, the Somerset landscape itself feels charged with this ancient spiritual energy, making the idea of the Grail resting somewhere beneath the green fields a compelling and poetic possibility. Other claimants dot the map of Europe. Genoa Cathedral houses the Sacro Catino, a hexagonal green glass bowl said to have been used at the Last Supper and later brought to the city after the First Crusade. In the Pyrenees, the monastery of San Juan de la Peña claims its own holy chalice passed down through the centuries, and even further afield, theories have placed the Grail in the mysterious fortress of Montségur, the last stronghold of the Cathar heretics who were said to guard a great treasure before their fall. This proliferation of claimants only underscores the Grail's power. Every kingdom, every church wanted to be the home of this ultimate relic, for it would grant them not just spiritual prestige but immense political power and wealth from pilgrims. In the end, the true power of the Holy Grail may lie not in its existence as a physical object, but in its existence as a perfect story. It combined the martial culture of knighthood with the ascetic ideals of monasticism, creating a new hero for a changing time. It offered a goal that was eternally out of reach, ensuring the quest would never truly end. And it provided a tangible connection to the divine that was personal and transformative rather than institutional. Whether it rests in a Spanish cathedral, lies hidden in the English earth, or exists only in the realm of story, the Grail remains the ultimate medieval mystery because it is a mirror. It reflects not what was, but what people desperately wanted to believe was possible. That purity of heart could be rewarded with a vision of heaven on earth. Of all the medieval manuscripts that have survived the centuries, none casts a longer or more sinister shadow than the Codex Gigas, a book so colossal and so strange that it earned a nickname fit for legend, the Devil's Bible. Imagine a volume that requires two people just to lift it, a towering tome of vellum standing nearly 3 feet tall, almost 20 inches wide, and weighing in at a staggering 165 pounds. Its very existence seems to defy logic, a monumental feat of human endurance that, according to the dark folklore surrounding it, might not have been entirely human at all. This is not just a book, it is an artifact that feels like it was born from a pact, a physical manifestation of ambition and terror that continues to baffle historians and entice those drawn to the unexplained. The legend behind its creation is as compelling as it is chilling. Sometime in the early 13th century, within the walls of the Benedictine monastery of Podlages in Bohemia, a monk had committed a terrible sin. The specifics of his transgression have been lost to time, though some versions of the tale claim it was a violation of his holy vows so severe that his punishment was to be walled up alive, entombed within the very monastery he had disgraced. In a desperate bid for salvation, the monk promised his brothers an impossible act of atonement. He vowed to create, in a single night, a book that would contain all human knowledge, a work that would bring eternal glory to the monastery. As the sun set and he began his task, he quickly realized the sheer impossibility of his vow. With hope fading and dawn approaching, he did the unthinkable. He prayed not to God, but to the fallen angel Lucifer, offering his soul in exchange for the completion of the book. Satan, the great deceiver, agreed. The monk's hand flew across the page, guided by an infernal power, and by morning the book was complete. As a permanent, mocking signature of their bargain, the devil added a full-page portrait of himself into the sacred text, a reminder of the terrible price paid for its creation. While the supernatural tale is fantastical, the physical reality of the Codex Gigas is astonishing enough on its own. The book is composed of 310 pages of vellum, a material made from the skins of approximately 160 donkeys. It contains a complete version of the Latin Vulgate Bible, the standard biblical text of the Middle Ages, but it goes far beyond that. This single volume is a complete medieval library in itself. Alongside the Old and New Testaments, its pages hold the complete works of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, a collection of medical works by figures like Constantine the African, a chronicle of Bohemian history by Cosmas of Prague, various treatises on exorcism and penitence, and even a calendar with a necrology listing the names of saints and local dignitaries. This was a book designed to be an encyclopedic repository of everything the monastery might need, from spiritual guidance to practical medicine to historical record. The sheer volume of text is staggering, estimated at over 120,000 lines. To write it all by hand in a consistent script would have been a lifetime's work for a single scribe. This is where the mystery truly deepens, moving from folklore into the realm of fascinating forensic analysis. For centuries, the legend of the single scribe was accepted because the handwriting throughout the massive codex appears remarkably uniform. It is a dense, professional Carolingian minuscule script, and to the naked eye, it looks like the work of one incredibly disciplined and tireless individual. However, modern analysis has revealed a more complex and human story. While the script is consistent, subtle variations in the formation of certain letters and the shading of the ink suggest the work of not one, but perhaps 2 or even 3 scribes working in close collaboration. Furthermore, a detailed study of the ink and the consistency of the handwriting suggests a timeline of creation that utterly demolishes the one-night myth. The prevailing theory among historians and paleographers is that the codex was likely the work of a dedicated team laboring for an estimated 20 to 30 years, not a single desperate night. The legend of the single monk and his diabolical pact seems to be a later invention, a story woven to explain the otherwise inexplicable scale and grandeur of the book. Yet, even with this more rational explanation, the Codex Gigas retains an aura of the uncanny. There is the matter of the infamous devil portrait itself. On page 290, nestled among sacred texts, is a stunning, full-page illustration of the devil. He is depicted as a monstrous, almost bestial figure, crouching alone in a void of empty parchment. His body is white and hairy, with sharp claws on his hands and feet, and he wears a strange white loincloth. Most striking are the 2 red, forked tongues protruding from his mouth. The page facing this terrifying image is a vivid contrast, a magnificent depiction of the heavenly city, representing the kingdom of heaven. This deliberate pairing has been interpreted in many ways as a stark warning against sin, a representation of the eternal struggle between good and evil, or perhaps even a symbolic map of the monk's own spiritual journey from damnation to hoped for redemption. The portrait is so powerful that it has overshadowed the rest of the book's contents, branding it forever as an object of dark curiosity. The subsequent history of the Codex Gigas is as dramatic as its origins. It was seized as spoils of war by the Swedish army in 1648 during the 30 Years' War from the Prague Castle treasury, and it has remained in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm ever since, one of that nation's most prized plunders. It has survived fires, wars, and countless journeys, its immense weight and enduring presence a testament to the very human drive to create something lasting, something monumental. The Codex Gigas, therefore, stands at a fascinating crossroads. It is an object that can be explained by the diligent, collaborative work of medieval monks, a breathtaking achievement of human scholarship and perseverance. But it is also an object that will forever be wrapped in a legend of desperation and diabolical intervention. It challenges us to hold 2 truths in our minds at once: the rational history of its creation and the powerful, enduring power of the story we need to believe, a story about the terrifying cost of ambition and the thin, fragile line between divine inspiration and infernal temptation. High in the rugged foothills of the French Pyrenees, the stark silhouette of Montségur Castle stands as a solemn sentinel over one of the most tragic and enigmatic chapters of the Middle Ages. This was the final refuge of the Cathars, a religious community whose beliefs and very existence posed such a radical threat to the medieval Catholic Church that they were systematically eradicated in a crusade as brutal and merciless as any fought in the Holy Land. But the story of Montségur is more than a tale of religious persecution. It is the epicenter of an enduring legend, a mystery that whispers of a last, desperate act to hide a treasure of unimaginable value from the forces of annihilation. What was smuggled out of that besieged fortress in the dead of winter, and where did it go? To understand the treasure, we must first understand the people who died to protect it. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, were a Gnostic Christian sect that flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries. Their beliefs were utterly heretical to the medieval church, They were dualists, believing the world of matter was created by an evil, lesser god, the demiurge, while the world of spirit was the creation of the one true, benevolent God. They saw the Catholic Church itself as the church of this evil creator, a corrupt and worldly institution. They rejected its sacraments, its hierarchy, and most crucially, the doctrine of the Incarnation, believing that Christ was a purely spiritual being who could not have suffered and died on a material cross. For the Cathars, salvation came not through the church, but through a ritual called the consolamentum, a baptism of the Spirit that transformed an ordinary believer into a perfectus, one of the spiritual elite who lived lives of extreme asceticism, renouncing all worldly goods, meat, and even marriage. This radical challenge could not be tolerated. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a 20-year war of extermination that pitted the northern French nobility against the southern Occitan lords who protected the Cathar communities. It was a war marked by incredible brutality, most infamously at the city of Béziers, where when asked how to tell Catholic from Cathar, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly declared, "Kill them all. God will know his own." By the spring of 1243, the crusade was all but over. The last major stronghold of resistance was the remote mountain fortress of Montségur, a natural citadel that housed about 400 people, including 200 perfecti. For 10 months, the castle was besieged by over 10,000 Crusader troops. The defenders held out with astonishing tenacity, but by March 1244, their situation was hopeless. They negotiated a surrender. The terms were stark. Any heretic who renounced their faith would be spared. Those who did not would be burned alive. On the 16th of March, a 15-day truce began. And then something extraordinary happened. Under the cover of this truce, under the very noses of the besieging army, at least 2 and perhaps 4 individuals used ropes to descend the sheer 1,000-foot cliff face on the castle's eastern side and vanished into the winter landscape. The Crusaders, focused on the main gates, seemed not to notice or chose not to interfere. These escapees were not fleeing for their lives, they were on a mission. They were carrying something. This is the heart of the mystery. What was the treasure of Montségur that was worth such a perilous effort on the eve of total defeat? The most poignant and likely answer is that it was not a treasure of gold or jewels at all. Contemporary chronicles refer to the escapees carrying their treasure and secret, but to the Cathars, who renounced all material wealth, their greatest treasure was spiritual. Many historians believe the fugitives were a group of perfecti carrying the community's collective funds to ensure the survival of their faith, but more importantly, they may have been safeguarding their most sacred objects, the liturgical books that contained their rituals, perhaps even a copy of the Gospel of John which they held in special esteem. For a faith on the brink of extinction, preserving its knowledge and its very means of spiritual practice was the ultimate act of defiance. The survival of a few perfecti with the knowledge to perform the consolamentum meant the survival of Catharism itself, and indeed, the faith persisted in secret for decades after the fall of Montségur. But this rational explanation has done little to quiet the more spectacular legends that grew up around the event in the centuries that followed. The most famous theory, popularized in the 20th century, connects the Cathar treasure directly to the greatest of all medieval relics, the Holy Grail. Proponents of this idea suggest that the Grail, whether the cup of the Last Supper or a more esoteric symbol of divine knowledge, had been in the protection of the Cathars, the purest of Christian sects. As the Crusaders closed in, the story goes, the Grail was smuggled out of Montségur to save it from desecration. Some versions of the tale even speak of a dazzling light seen emanating from the mountain on the night of the escape, a sign of the relic's divine power. This legend is powerfully evocative, weaving together the tragedy of the Cathars with the enduring myth of the Grail, suggesting that the true vessel of Christ's blood was saved not by knights in shining armor, but by heretics condemned to the fire. Other theories venture even further into the realm of speculation. Could the treasure have been something even more explosive than the Grail? Some suggest it was a collection of ancient Gnostic texts that contained alternative Christian histories, knowledge that could have shattered the foundations of the Church. Others have floated the idea of the treasure of the Temple of Jerusalem, looted by the Romans and perhaps later making its way to the south of France through trade routes. There are even fringe theories that speak of a meteorological or atomic secret, a power source of some kind, though these lack any historical foundation. The mystery is further compounded by the landscape itself. The countryside around Montségur is a labyrinth of deep caves, forgotten tunnels, and dense forests, a perfect place to hide something forever. For generations, treasure hunters have scoured the area, drawn by local folklore and cryptic clues, but nothing definitively linked to the Cathars has ever been found. The final act at Montségur adds a layer of haunting solemnity to the mystery. On the 16th of March, the truce ended. More than 200 perfecti and lay believers who refused to renounce their faith were led down the mountain. At the foot of the peak, a large pyre had been built in a field that still bears the name Prat dels Cremats, the Field of the Burned. They walked willingly into the flames, a mass martyrdom that became the defining symbol of Cathar resistance. They died protecting a secret, and they took its nature with them. The treasure of Montségur, therefore, exists in two forms. It is the probable historical reality of a rescued spiritual heritage that allowed a scattered faith to linger in the shadows. And it is the powerful, enduring legend of a lost relic of ultimate power, hidden somewhere in the deep, silent valleys of the Pyrenees. It is a mystery that perfectly captures the essence of the Cathars themselves, a story of spirit triumphing over matter, of a truth so valuable that men and women chose to be consumed by fire rather than reveal it. Following the profound tragedy of Montségur, we now journey forward 2 centuries to witness the final, gasping breath of an empire that had stood for a millennium, and to a loss that echoes not through mountain caves, but through the very soul of Western history. On the 29th of May, 1453, the great city of Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Roman Empire in the east, fell to the besieging armies of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, tore off his imperial regalia, charged into the fray alongside his soldiers, and vanished into the chaos, his body never identified. It was a catastrophic event that sent a seismic shock through Christendom, but the fall of the city was more than a military defeat. It was the extinguishing of a living flame, a direct link to the classical world. And with its fall came one of the greatest historical vanishings of all, the complete and utter disappearance of the imperial crown jewels of Byzantium, a collection of regalia so ancient and so saturated with symbolic power that its absence is a cultural wound that has never fully healed. To understand the magnitude of this loss, one must appreciate what these objects represented. This was not merely a set of expensive jewelry. It was the physical manifestation of an unbroken line of authority stretching all the way back to Augustus Caesar. The most sacred item was the crown itself. Unlike the elaborate, bejeweled crowns of Western Europe, the Byzantine imperial crown was a relatively simple golden diadem or helmet, but it was believed to be of immense antiquity. Some traditions held that it was the very crown of the Emperor Constantine the Great himself, the founder of the city. It was studded with pearls and priceless gems, but its true value was hieratic, a direct blessing from God upon the ruler who wore it. Alongside the crown were the other instruments of power, the emperor's scepter, his orb, the imperial sword, and his lavish purple and gold robes, dyed with Tyrian purple, a color so exclusive its use was forbidden to anyone outside the imperial family. These were not just ornaments, they were a crucial part of the intricate theater of Byzantine power, designed to project an image of the emperor as God's vice-regent on earth, a semi-divine figure of overwhelming majesty and authority. So what became of these priceless treasures on that terrible May Day? The theories are as numerous as they are frustratingly unresolved. The the most straightforward and perhaps most tragic explanation is that they were simply looted and melted down. The sack of Constantinople was 3 days of unrestrained pillaging. The Ottoman soldiers and even many of their Christian allies were primarily interested in portable wealth. A golden crown could be broken apart, its gems pried out and sold individually, and the gold itself melted into ingots. For a victorious army, the symbolic value of the regalia meant nothing compared to the raw monetary value of the materials. If this was their fate, it would be a grimly practical end for objects that had been revered for over 1,000 years, their history dissolved in a crucible to be recycled into coin or jewelry. A more hopeful, though equally unproven, theory suggests that the regalia were part of the official Ottoman war booty, carefully collected and presented to Sultan Mehmed. The young Sultan was a complex figure, a ruthless conqueror, but also a man deeply fascinated by Roman history and imperial grandeur. He saw himself not as the destroyer of the Roman Empire, but as its successor. He took the title Caesar of Rome and moved his capital to Constantinople, which he renamed Istanbul. It is conceivable that he would have appreciated the profound symbolic weight of the Byzantine regalia. He might have kept them as a trophy to legitimize his new rule, perhaps even incorporating elements into his own ceremonial wardrobe. Some rumors persist that the crown and jewels were stored in the Topkapi Palace treasury, only to be lost or dispersed in later centuries during periods of upheaval or palace fires. However, no definitive Ottoman inventory from the time lists them, and they are conspicuously absent from the stunning collection that remains in Topkapi today. This absence fuels the most romantic of the theories, that in the final, desperate hours before the walls were breached, a loyal retainer or a member of the imperial family managed to smuggle the most sacred regalia out of the city. Constantinople was a vast metropolis with multiple harbors, and despite the Ottoman blockade, several ships did manage to escape, carrying refugees to Italy and beyond. Could the crown have been secretly whisked away to safety? The most likely destination would have been Rome, to the court of the Pope, or perhaps to Mistra in Greece, where the emperor's brothers still ruled. Others speculate it was taken to the monastic republic of Mount Athos, a spiritual heart of the Orthodox world, to be hidden away in a sealed vault. There are even tantalizing legends that connect the lost regalia to the same family that brought the Byzantine library to Moscow, suggesting a double exodus of both knowledge and power from the dying empire. Yet, despite centuries of searching and speculation, not a single piece of the official imperial regalia has ever surfaced in any European collection, church, or monastery. If they were saved, they remain one of history's most perfectly kept secrets. The loss is profoundly felt because it represents the severing of a tangible link. With the crown jewels gone, the physical continuity of the Roman Empire was finally, irrevocably broken. There is no artifact that we can point to and say, this was worn by the emperors of Constantinople. Their absence creates a void where a cornerstone of our shared heritage should be. It relegates the splendor of Byzantium to the realm of description in texts and the static beauty of mosaics, denying us the awe of standing before the actual objects that defined 1,000 years of power, faith, and ceremony. The lost crown of Byzantium is more than a missing treasure. It is a ghost, a symbol of all that was extinguished when the city fell, a silent reminder of an entire world that vanished into the smoke and chaos of a single, fateful Tuesday in May. Across the Atlantic, far from the crumbling walls of Constantinople, another civilization faced a collapse so complete it has become a synonym for mysterious abandonment. In the high desert of the American Southwest, beneath the relentless sun and vast turquoise sky, stand the silent ruins of a people who simply vanished. These are the magnificent cliff dwellings of the ancestral Pueblones, a culture we often know by the name given to them by the Navajo, the Anasazi, which translates rather hauntingly to ancient enemies or ancient ones. Their story is not one of a single cataclysmic siege, but of a slower, more puzzling unraveling. A voluntary exodus from some of the most dramatic and sophisticated architecture ever created in North America, leaving behind empty cities that would remain untouched for centuries. To understand the mystery of their disappearance, one must first appreciate the breathtaking scale of their achievement. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the ancestral Puebloan culture was at its zenith. They were not primitive nomads, they were master builders, astronomers, and artists. Their greatest works, like the immense, multi-storied complex of Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde or the stunning white-walled pueblos of Choco Canyon, represent a staggering feat of engineering and social organization. They constructed entire villages tucked into sheer cliff faces, accessible only by perilous hand and toe holds carved into the rock. They built great houses in Choco with hundreds of rooms, aligned with celestial events like the solstices and equinoxes, and connected by a vast network of straight, meticulously engineered roads that stretched across the desert for hundreds of miles. This was a sophisticated, interconnected society, one that had thrived in an arid environment for generations. And then, within a remarkably short period around the end of the 13th century, they walked away from it all. The evidence of their departure is eerie and complete. Archaeologists find potsherds from vessels left behind, grinding stones set down in the middle of meal preparation, sandals and tools simply abandoned in place. It is not the scene of a panicked flight from an invader. There is no evidence of widespread violence or conquest. Instead, it feels deliberate yet urgent. It is as if a decision was made by an entire people to simply move on, leaving their homes and most of their possessions to the elements. For a long time, this led to wild speculation, including theories of alien abduction or a sudden mass spiritual vanishing. But modern archaeology points to a more complex and sobering confluence of factors, a perfect storm of environmental and social crises that made staying in their ancestral homelands impossible. The most prominent villain in this story is a profound and prolonged drought. Tree-ring data from ancient ponderosa pines provides a precise climate record, and it reveals a period of exceptional aridity known as the Great Drought, which gripped the region from approximately 1276 to 1299. For a culture practicing dry land agriculture on the margin of a desert, this was a catastrophe. Their carefully managed fields of maize, beans, and squash would have withered, their stored surpluses dwindling year after year. The delicate balance between population and resources, maintained for centuries through sophisticated water conservation techniques like check dams and reservoirs, was shattered. Hunger and thirst became constant companions, but drought alone is not a complete explanation. These were a resilient people who had weathered dry spells before. Something else must have pushed them past a tipping point. This leads to the second major factor: severe resource depletion. Decades, even centuries, of intensive living in the same area took its toll. The forests for miles around the Great Pueblos were cleared for building timber and firewood, leading to soil erosion. The large populations of game animals like deer and rabbits were likely overhunted. The combination of drought and human pressure would have created an ecological death spiral. The very land that had sustained them was now turning against them, becoming barren and unable to support the complex society built upon it. The magnificent roads of Choco Canyon, which once connected a thriving ceremonial network, may have become pathways for a desperate search for new resources, or perhaps solemn roads for a final collective farewell. Yet, even environment and ecology don't tell the whole story. There is compelling evidence of increasing social unrest and even violence in the final decades. Archaeologists have found settlements from this period that were built in increasingly defensible positions, high on mesa tops with limited access points. Some sites show evidence of burned structures and unburied bodies, suggesting internecine conflict. After generations of cooperation, it seems society began to fracture under the immense strain of scarcity. When trust breaks down and neighbors become competitors for the last remaining food and water, the social contract that holds a civilization together can disintegrate rapidly. The intricate religious and political systems that organized their world, perhaps centered on the great houses of Choco, may have lost their authority in the face of such unrelenting hardship, leaving a power vacuum filled by fear and conflict. So where did they go? The mystery is not that they vanished without a trace, but that they left a very clear trace that points south and east. This was not an extinction, it was a migration. The people we call the Anasazi did not disappear from the earth. They are the direct ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, such as the Hopi, Zuni, and the communities along the Rio Grande. Their oral histories speak of these varied journeys of emerging into this world and searching for the right place to live. They took their knowledge, their culture, and their identity with them, settling in new areas where water was more reliable, forming the compact, tightly knit villages that their descendants still inhabit today. The abandonment of the cliff dwellings was not an end, but a strategic retreat and a reorganization of their society in the face of insurmountable challenges. The empty cities left behind stand as a powerful monument to human adaptability and a stark, enduring warning about the fragility of even the greatest civilizations when the environment upon which they depend begins to collapse. The vast, empty pueblos of the American Southwest speak of a slow, deliberate exodus, but our next mystery presents the very opposite, a sudden and complete vanishing with no time for goodbyes. The year is 1391, and the scene is the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic just off the coast of Ireland. A small but sturdy merchant vessel, a type known as a carrack, is spotted drifting aimlessly by local fishermen. Its sails are tattered but still set, as if its crew had simply walked away from their posts in the middle of a task. When the fishermen manage to board the silent ship, they are met not with a scene of carnage, but with a profound and unsettling emptiness. The ship is fully provisioned. Barrels of fresh water and salted meat are still in the hold. The crew's personal belongings are still in their quarters. There is even food set out on the table in the galley, though it has long since spoiled. But of the crew itself, there is not a single soul, not a single trace. They have evaporated into the salt air, leaving behind a perfectly seaworthy vessel that would become the medieval world's most infamous ghost ship, a predecessor to legends like the Mary Celeste. This was far from an isolated incident in the medieval maritime world. Chronicles from the period are dotted with such accounts, each one feeding the deep-seated superstitions of sailors who already viewed the ocean as a realm of monsters and malevolent spirits. These weren't just stories told in taverns, they were recorded by monks and historians as factual, perplexing events. In the 13th century, a large trading cog was found adrift in the North Sea, its cargo intact and a fire still smoldering in its galley stove, but its crew utterly gone. Another account tells of a vessel discovered near the Azores with its lifeboat still securely fastened to the deck, ruling out a simple abandonment. For the people of the time, these occurrences defied rational explanation. The ocean was a dangerous and unknown frontier, and such mysteries were readily attributed to the supernatural. Whispers spread of ships being taken by sea monsters like the dreaded kraken, or falling prey to the siren's call, luring the entire crew to a watery grave. Some spoke of the Flying Dutchman, a phantom ship doomed to sail the seas for eternity, whose sighting was an omen of certain doom. These tales were a way to codify the terrifying randomness of the sea, to give a name and a shape to a fear that was otherwise formless. But if we pull back the veil of superstition, what practical, historical explanations could account for such a complete and sudden disappearance? The most immediate and terrifying possibility was piracy. The medieval seas were plagued by raiders, from the infamous Barbary corsairs of North Africa to the opportunistic freebooters of Europe. A swift attack could explain the lack of a struggle. A ship could be overtaken by a larger, faster vessel, its crew captured and taken as slaves to be sold in foreign ports. This was a common and devastatingly real fate for countless sailors. Yet the piracy theory often falters on one crucial detail: the value of the cargo and the ship itself. Why would pirates go to the effort of capturing a crew but then leave behind the very prize they fought for, the ship and its goods, allowing it to drift away as a ghost? It doesn't align with the primary motive of such raids, which was profit. This inconsistency leads to another, even darker theory: plague. A ship was a tightly confined petri dish, especially on a long voyage. If an infectious disease like the bubonic plague or cholera broke out on board, the results would have been swift and horrifying. Imagine a crew member falling ill. Within days, others would succumb. The terror of a painful, certain death from a sickness they could not see or understand could have triggered a mass panic. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, the healthy few might have taken to the ship's lone longboat, abandoning their infected comrades and the cursed vessel to the mercy of the waves, only to perish themselves lost at sea. This would leave the ship to drift with its grim cargo, a floating tomb that would later be discovered empty. The half-eaten meal on the table becomes a snapshot of the moment the first sailor collapsed, the beginning of the end. A more psychological but equally compelling explanation is mass hysteria or collective delusion. Sailors were often a deeply superstitious lot, living in a world of omens and portents. What if the crew collectively believed they had angered a saint or witnessed some terrifying omen like St. Elmo's fire dancing on the masts? Could a shared hallucination, perhaps brought on by contaminated food or water, such as ergot fungus in the bread, have convinced every single man that the ship was haunted or cursed? In a shared panic, they might have rushed the rails and thrown themselves into the sea, believing it a better fate than whatever they thought was stalking the decks. The ship, untouched, would then bear silent witness to their final, terrified flight. Perhaps the most plausible and tragic explanation lies in a simple, deadly accident unique to the sea. Medieval ships were treacherous workplaces. A sudden, large wave could sweep across the deck without warning, washing every soul on board into the ocean in an instant. The ship, designed to be buoyant and right itself, would sail on, barely scathed, while its human cargo was lost forever. Another maritime hazard was fumes. In the hold, rotting cargo or fermenting grain could produce dangerous pockets of carbon dioxide or other odorless, heavier-than-air gases. A sailor descending into the hold to inspect the cargo could be overcome instantly by the lack of oxygen, collapsing without a sound. A second sailor going to check on his silent crewmate would suffer the same fate. This deadly chain reaction could systematically claim every person on board, leaving the ship to sail itself as a ghost until the gas dissipated. The untouched meal and orderly state of the ship would be a perfect, chilling testament to this invisible killer. The enduring power of these medieval ghost ship stories lies in their perfect ambiguity. They provide just enough evidence to fuel a dozen theories, but never enough to confirm a single one. They are open-ended mysteries that live in the liminal space between the known and the unknown, between history and folklore. They forced medieval people to confront the vast, indifferent power of nature and the fragility of human life against it. Every time a sail was spotted on the horizon with no one at the helm, it was a visceral reminder that the sea kept its secrets well, and that sometimes the most terrifying answer of all is not a monster or a demon, but simply silence. From the silent, empty decks of vanished ships, we now journey to the heart of a desert, to a story of an entire army swallowed by the sands. The account comes from the ancient world's first great historian, Herodotus, a man who collected stories with the passion of a scholar, but sometimes the credulity of a traveler in a strange land. According to his writings, in the year 525 before the Common Era, the powerful Persian emperor Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, was in the process of conquering Egypt. His grip on the new territory was firm, but his temper was legendary, and it was this rage that supposedly set a catastrophic event in motion. Cambyses decided to send a military expedition to attack the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis, a place of immense spiritual significance deep in the western desert. The reason for this assault varies in the telling. Some say the priests of the oracle had refused to legitimize his claim to the Egyptian throne, a profound insult to his authority. Others suggest it was a simple act of impious vandalism, a conqueror's whim to demonstrate that no power, not even the gods, could defy him. Herodotus describes a massive force, 50,000 men. This was not a raiding party, but a veritable army, a colossal investment of military power for such a remote objective. They marched from the Nile city of Thebes, following established caravan routes that traced the edges of the desert's most formidable reaches. Their destination, the Siwa Oasis, was a known quantity, a fertile haven in the middle of nothingness, home to the famous oracle that Alexander the Great would later visit. The journey was arduous but not, in theory, impossible for a well-supplied force. Yet, according to the historian, the army never arrived. After days of marching, a fearsome wind, a khamsin, rose up from the south. This was no ordinary desert breeze. Herodotus describes it as a monstrous, fiery simoom, a sandstorm of apocalyptic proportions. It lifted the very desert itself into the air, creating a moving mountain of sand that descended upon the entire Persian host. When the wind finally died down, there was nothing to be seen. No men, no weapons, no banners. The army of 50,000 souls, along with all its equipment and animals, had been completely and utterly erased, buried beneath countless tons of sand as if they had never existed at all. For centuries, this tale was filed away as one of Herodotus's more colorful fables, a dramatic story told to illustrate the hubris of a king and the unforgiving power of the natural world. The idea that an army of that size could vanish without a single artifact, a single piece of evidence, seemed beyond belief. But in the modern era, with new technology and a renewed interest in historical cold cases, the story of Cambyses's lost army has been pulled from the shelf of myth and placed on the desk of archaeologists. The search for this force has become one of Egyptology's most captivating quests, a real-life hunt for a historical needle in a haystack the size of a country. The western desert of Egypt is a terrifyingly vast and empty place, a landscape of searing heat, shifting dunes, and rocky plateaus that has claimed the lives of unprepared travelers even with modern equipment. Finding a single archaeological site in this ocean of sand is a task that borders on madness. This has not stopped numerous expeditions from trying. The most famous and persistent seeker was an Italian archaeologist and geologist named Professor Paolo Gallo. In the 1990s and 2000s, his team launched multiple campaigns into the desert, using Herodotus's account as their primary map. They focused their search on a specific area, theorizing that the army, perhaps lost and disoriented, may have taken a wrong turn off the main caravan route and become trapped in a particularly treacherous area of sand seas. They employed every tool at their disposal, from traditional foot surveys to ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, hoping to find a spear tip, a piece of bronze armor, or even a single coin that could confirm the army's presence. The desert, however, is a master of secrecy. It gives up its treasures reluctantly. Gallo's teams found evidence of ancient trade routes, Roman outposts, and even prehistoric settlements, but no definitive sign of 50,000 Persians. The search entered the space age with the use of satellite imagery. Experts began scanning declassified Cold War-era spy satellite photos and modern commercial imagery, looking for any subtle, unnatural patterns on the surface that might hint at a massive burial site. The theory was that if the army was buried in a single, catastrophic event, the layering of sand over such a large area of metal and organic material might create a unique spectral signature or affect the growth of desert vegetation in a way visible from orbit. While this technology has been revolutionary in locating lost cities and buried pyramids, the specific, scattered nature of what they were looking for, not a structure, but a dispersed collection of objects has made it an incredibly difficult task. The sand that buried the army would have continued to shift and move over 2.5 millennia, potentially scattering any remains over a huge area or burying them to depths that are simply unreachable. So, what are we to make of this ancient mystery? The skeptics have compelling arguments. There is no mention of such a devastating loss of military manpower in any Persian sources, which you would expect for such a catastrophic blow to their imperial ambitions. It is possible Herodotus, who was famously critical of the Persians, invented or exaggerated the story as a moral fable about the divine punishment of arrogant kings. Perhaps the army wasn't wiped out by a sandstorm at all, but was defeated in a battle by Egyptian forces or Libyan tribesmen, and the sandstorm was a face-saving legend propagated by the few survivors who straggled back to Thebes. Yet the power of the story endures because the desert is fully capable of such an act. Sandstorms in the region can indeed be terrifyingly violent, with winds that can strip paint from cars and visibility that drops to zero in seconds. There are well-documented accounts from World War II of entire tank divisions being halted and disoriented by similar storms. For an ancient army without maps or compasses, a severe khamsin would have been a truly existential threat. It is not difficult to imagine a force becoming hopelessly lost, succumbing to thirst and exposure, and being gradually buried by the drifting dunes over time, their story condensed into the single dramatic event of the storm. The lost army of Cambyses sits at that perfect intersection of history and legend. It is a story that feels just plausible enough to be true, and just incredible enough to capture our imagination for 2,500 years, a permanent reminder that some secrets, once buried by the desert, are meant to stay that way. Leaving behind the silent deserts and their swallowed armies, we turn now to an object that resides not in the sands but behind bulletproof glass, an artifact that has inspired both profound devotion and fierce skepticism for centuries. This is the Shroud of Turin, a length of linen cloth measuring 14 feet by 3, and bearing the faint, haunting imprint of a man who appears to have suffered the torturous death of crucifixion. To millions of believers, this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, a divine self-portrait created at the moment of resurrection. To skeptics, it is the most brilliant, beguiling, and successful forgery of the Middle Ages. Its story is a perfect collision of faith and science, a mystery that, despite some of the most advanced forensic analysis ever applied to an ancient object, stubbornly refuses to yield a final, definitive answer. The shroud's documented history begins, rather inconveniently for its proponents, in the 1350s. A French knight named Geoffroy de Charny presented it to the canons of a church he founded in Liège, France. Its sudden appearance without any prior historical record immediately raised eyebrows. In 1390, the local bishop of Troyes, Henry de Poitiers, even declared it a clever painting after he claimed the artist who created it had confessed to him. This early controversy set the tone for the debates that would follow for the next 600 years. The cloth passed through the hands of the powerful Savoy family, surviving a chapel fire in 1532 that melted the silver casket it was stored in, leaving the characteristic scorch marks and water stains we see on it today. It eventually found a permanent home in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, in the 16th century, where it has remained, an object of pilgrimage and intense scrutiny. The central, mesmerizing mystery of the shroud is the image itself. It is not a painting in any conventional sense. There is no pigment, no brushstrokes, no outline. The sepia-toned image is a superficial discoloration of the linen's topmost fibrils, less than a millionth of an inch deep. It possesses astonishing photographic-like qualities, acting as a perfect negative. When the first photograph of the shroud was taken in 1898 by lawyer Secondo Pia, the developed negative plate revealed a stunningly detailed positive image of a man with a serene, bearded face, complete with three-dimensional information encoded within the varying intensity of the image. This was a property utterly unknown to any medieval forger. How could someone in the 13th or 14th century create a perfect negative image that only makes sense when viewed through technology invented 500 years later? The image formation defies replication even with 21st century technology. Experiments with paints, acids, powders, and even primitive photography have failed to produce a replica that captures all of the shroud's unique characteristics, including its three-dimensional data and its superficial, non-directional nature. Further deepening the enigma are the apparent bloodstains. Spectroscopic analysis has identified the presence of hemoglobin, bilirubin, and other compounds consistent with human blood. The stains show a clear serum halo around them, a forensic detail that occurs as blood clots and the serum separates, a nuance far beyond the knowledge of any medieval painter. The wounds depicted are forensically accurate to Roman crucifixion practices. Punctures in the wrists, not the palms, which would not support the weight of a body. Scourge marks from a Roman flagrum across the back and legs, a wound in the side, and even injuries consistent with a crown of thorns. The anatomical precision is startling, depicting a real human body in a state of rigor mortis. For many, this level of medical and historical accuracy is powerful evidence for authenticity. Then came the year 1988, and what many believed would be the final word on the matter. With the permission of the Vatican, 3 independent laboratories at the University of Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology were given postage stamp-sized samples from a single corner of the shroud for radiocarbon dating. The scientific world held its breath. The results, published in the journal Nature, were unequivocal. The flax plants used to make the linen had been harvested between 1260 and 1390. This placed the shroud's origin firmly in the medieval period, seemingly confirming it was a forgery created shortly before its first appearance in Lyre. For skeptics, the case was closed. Science had spoken, but the story did not end there. Almost immediately, critics of the carbon dating raised serious objections. They argued the sample taken was from a corner of the shroud that had been handled, mended, and contaminated for centuries. They pointed to the fire of 1532, which could have caused carbon monoxide contamination, skewing the date younger. Some researchers have since suggested that a bacterial and fungal biofilm growing on the linen threads over centuries could have fundamentally altered the carbon signature, making the cloth appear much newer than it actually is. While the scientific consensus still strongly supports the carbon dating results, these questions have provided just enough doubt to keep the controversy alive. So where does this leave us? We are left with an object that presents an apparently impossible set of contradictions. If it is a medieval forgery, we must accept that an unknown genius working over 6 centuries ago possessed knowledge of anatomy, forensics, photography, and chemistry that would not be discovered for hundreds of years, and used a method of image creation that modern science cannot replicate. If it is authentic, we must explain the carbon dating and its absence from historical record before the 1350s. The Shroud of Turin, therefore, is more than a piece of cloth. It is a Rorschach test. What you see in its faint, mysterious image often says more about your own beliefs than it does about the cloth itself. It represents the eternal struggle to find objective truth in the subjective realms of history and faith, a tangible link to the past that remains, like so many medieval mysteries, perfectly and profoundly out of reach. From the silent, shifting sands of Egypt to the cryptic image on a linen cloth, history holds its secrets tightly. Yet some vanishings are not of armies or artifacts, but of people, an entire community erased from a fledgling outpost on the edge of a new world. Our journey now takes us across the Atlantic to the coast of what is now North Carolina, to a small, vulnerable settlement that would become the birthplace of a mystery that has haunted the American imagination for over 4 centuries. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, a community that vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind a single, tantalizing word that has taunted historians and archaeologists ever since. The year was 1587, sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh and led by Governor John White. A group of about 115 English men, women, and children established a settlement on Roanoke Island. This was England's boldest attempt to plant a permanent foothold in the New World, a beachhead against Spanish dominance. The colonists' plan was to create a self-sufficient community, but they were immediately beset by challenges. Their relations with the local Secottan people, initially wary, had deteriorated into outright hostility following the actions of a previous military expedition. Supplies were low and the environment was unfamiliar and intimidating. Just a month after their arrival, with the settlement barely established, the colonists persuaded Governor White, who was also the grandfather of the first English child born in the Americas, little Virginia Dare, to sail back to England for more supplies and reinforcements. It was a decision born of desperation and one that would have unimaginable consequences. White's return to England was catastrophically ill-timed. He arrived to find his homeland preparing to face the massive Spanish Armada. Every seaworthy ship was commandeered for the defense of the realm, and White, despite his frantic pleas, found himself trapped for 3 long years, unable to secure passage back to his family and his colony. When he finally managed to return in August of 1590, he stepped onto the shores of Roanoke to find a scene of profound and utter silence. The settlement was deserted. The crude fort had been dismantled and the houses had been carefully taken down, their posts and beams removed, suggesting a planned and orderly departure, not a panicked flight. There were no signs of a struggle, no graves, and no human remains. The only clues were 2 cryptic carvings. On a post of the fort's entrance, the word Croatoan was carved in capital letters. On a nearby tree, the letters Crow were found. This was not a message of distress. White had specifically arranged this with the colonists before he left. If they were forced to abandon the site, they were to carve the name of their destination into a visible location. If they were under duress, they were to add a Maltese cross above the word. There was no cross. To White, Croatoan was a clear signal. It was the name of a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island, which was home to a tribe of Native Americans who had been friendly to the English. It seemed the colonists had simply moved 50 miles south to live with their allies, but a fierce storm was brewing and White sailors refused to sail further. He was forced to return to England without ever reaching Croatoan Island, and the fate of the lost colony was sealed into legend. For centuries, the primary theories have orbited these few known facts. The most persistent and hopeful theory is that the colonists did exactly as their message implied. They assimilated with the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island. This was not an unheard of practice. Europeans captured or welcomed into Native American tribes often integrated fully into the community. Proponents of this theory point to later accounts from English explorers in the following decades. In the early 1600s, settlers from the successful Jamestown colony heard reports from various Powhatan chiefs of Englishmen living in villages to the south. Captain John Smith himself was told of people dressed like Englishmen living in native towns. Most compellingly, in 1610, the Jamestown colony received a dramatic visit from a young Native American boy who was the son of a Croatoan woman. The boy had light skin and fair hair, and he told the settlers that his ancestors could talk out of a book, and that some people in his village had built 2-story houses with stone walls, details that seemed to point directly to the lost Roanoke settlers. If this assimilation occurred, the colonists would have slowly lost their distinct European identity over generations, their bloodlines and perhaps some of their stories blending into those of the coastal Algonquian peoples. Other theories are far darker. Perhaps the colony was wiped out by disease, a common and devastating fate for European settlements that lacked immunity to New World pathogens. Maybe they fell victim to a Spanish attack from their colony in Florida, who saw the English outpost as a threat to their own claims. or given the known tensions, they could have been attacked by the hostile Secotan tribe who had ample reason to want the English gone. The orderly state of the abandoned village, however, argues against a sudden, violent end. A massacre or a raid would have left evidence, weapons, bodies, signs of burning. The careful dismantling of the structures suggests a deliberate, if hurried, decision to leave and a hope of rebuilding elsewhere. In recent years, archaeology has begun to move the needle from speculation toward evidence, though the picture remains frustratingly incomplete. The Croatoan clue has led researchers to focus on Hatteras Island, where a team from the University of Bristol has been excavating for years. Their findings are not a smoking gun, but a compelling collection of circumstantial evidence that strongly supports the assimilation theory. They have unearthed a mix of English and Native American artifacts from the correct time period, all found together in the same archaeological layers. These aren't just random trade goods, they are personal, everyday items that suggest cohabitation. They include parts of a rapier sword, pieces of a gun mechanism, a writing slate likely used for teaching, and, most intriguingly, a gold signet ring from the 16th century, all found alongside traditional Croatoan pottery and tools. This fusion of material culture paints a picture not of a colony wiped out, but of one that was absorbed, its people living alongside the Croatoans, adopting their ways while still preserving and using their own precious belongings for a generation or two. Further inland, another fascinating theory has emerged from the work of the First Colony Foundation. Examining a map John White drew of the region, researchers using modern imaging technology discovered a hidden symbol, a patch covering a secret star shape, over a location 50 miles inland on the mainland at the head of the Albemarle Sound. This spot, now known as Site X, was theorized to be a pre-arranged fallback position, a place the colonists might have designated as a rendezvous point if they had to leave Roanoke. Excavations at Site X have yielded more tantalizing, if still inconclusive, evidence. Fragments of pottery from a type of storage jar known to have been used at Roanoke called Surrey ware, and other English artifacts from the late 16th century. This suggests that at least a small group from the colony may have traveled there, possibly scouting the location or even settling there temporarily before perhaps moving on to join the Croatoans or meeting another fate. The truth of Roanoke is likely a combination of these threads. It is improbable that a single catastrophe befell every last man, woman, and child. A more plausible scenario is that the colony, facing starvation and isolation after 3 years, made a collective decision to break into smaller groups. One large group may have gone south to live with the Croatoans on Hatteras Island, as the carving suggested. Another, smaller group may have attempted to travel inland to the pre-arranged Site X, perhaps hoping to find a better location or to make contact with other tribes. Disease, conflict, or hardship could have claimed this smaller group, explaining the scattered English artifacts found away from the coast. The lost colony's enduring power lies in this lack of a final answer. It is the original American mystery, a story of hope, hardship, and disappearance that represents all the terrifying unknowns the early explorers faced. It is a ghost story that is also a history, a puzzle whose missing pieces continue to lure us into the dense forests and sandy shores of the Outer Banks, searching for the echoes of those first English voices that faded into the American wilderness. The shadow of the gallows had fallen over France, and the most powerful military order in Christendom was being systematically dismantled. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, King Philip IV of France launched his devastating surprise attack, arresting Templars across the country on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption. Their vast lands were seized, their treasuries confiscated, and their knights were dragged into dungeons to face torture and execution. Yet, amidst the chaos of this carefully orchestrated downfall, a significant portion of the order's power seemingly vanished into thin air. While the king's men stormed preceptories on land, they found the Templar docks suspiciously empty. the Order's formidable naval fleet, a key instrument of their financial and military might, was gone. This was not a ragtag collection of fishing boats, this was an armada. The Knights Templar operated their own naval fleet from multiple ports, most significantly from La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast. These ships were the vital arteries of their empire, used to transport massive amounts of bullion, troops, and pilgrims between Europe and the Holy Land, and to manage their vast commercial trading network that stretched across the Mediterranean. For an organization known for its meticulous planning and foresight, the simultaneous disappearance of their entire maritime force at the moment of their greatest crisis seems far too convenient to be a coincidence. It suggests a contingency plan executed with precision, raising the inevitable question: where did the ships go and what priceless cargo were they carrying to safety? The most persistent and romantic theory places the escaped Templar fleet on a course for Scotland. The logic is compelling. Scotland at that time was under the excommunication of the Pope, making it a legal no-man's land where Philip IV's warrants and papal bulls held little authority. It was also the domain of Robert the Bruce, who was himself excommunicated and locked in a bitter war for Scottish independence against England, a close ally of France. The Templars, now outlaws, would have found a natural ally in another king defying the established powers of Europe. The legend goes that the fleet sailed from La Rochelle, navigated around the British Isles, and arrived in Scotland, where they unloaded their treasure and their most sacred relics. Their arrival is then famously linked to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce's vastly outnumbered forces secured a stunning victory against the English. Folk tales speak of a mysterious contingent of unknown, heavily armored knights who appeared at a crucial moment to turn the tide of the battle. Knights who could only have been the Templars, fighting for their new cause and their new king. This narrative provides a clean and heroic end to their story. Not annihilation, but reinvention, their military prowess channeled into the birth of a new nation. But what could have been so valuable aboard those ships that it warranted such a desperate, secretive voyage? The obvious answer is treasure. The Templars were the bankers of Europe, and the Paris Temple was the financial center of the continent. While King Philip did seize a considerable amount of wealth from their French holdings, the sums fell far short of contemporary estimates of their total holdings. It is entirely plausible that the bulk of their movable wealth, gold, silver, and jewels, was loaded onto ships at La Rochelle before the king's men could arrive. However, many researchers believe the true treasure was not monetary but spiritual. The Templars were rumored to have discovered something profound beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during their early years. Perhaps the lost treasures of the Temple of Solomon, ancient manuscripts containing esoteric knowledge, or even relics of immense power like the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail itself. If such artifacts existed, protecting them from a vengeful king and a complicit pope would have been the Order's highest priority. Their escape fleet, therefore, becomes a sort of ark, carrying not just gold, but the seeds of hidden knowledge into the future, its legacy perhaps influencing the rise of Scottish Freemasonry centuries later. An even more audacious theory, one that fundamentally rewrites the history of exploration, suggests the Templar fleet did not stop in Scotland but continued sailing west into the open Atlantic. Proponents of this idea point to the Order's well-documented nautical expertise. For nearly 200 years, they had been regularly crossing the Mediterranean and sailing to the Levant. They would have accumulated a deep understanding of ocean currents, navigation, and shipbuilding that far exceeded that of most contemporary mariners. It is speculated that they had secret knowledge of lands across the ocean, passed down from earlier seafaring cultures or discovered during their own voyages. The Sinclair family of Scotland, later linked to Templar traditions, is famously connected to the voyage of Henry Sinclair to North America in the late 14th century, a journey that would have occurred within living memory of the Order's suppression. Could this have been based on earlier secret Templar maps, The mysterious carvings in Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which include depictions of plants like maize and aloe vera native to the Americas long before Columbus's voyage, are often cited as potential evidence for this pre-Columbian knowledge. If the fleeing Templars did cross the Atlantic, they may have established a small, hidden outpost, their vast treasure and archives remaining undiscovered somewhere in the wilderness of North America, their story lost to history. Despite these captivating theories, the historical reality of the Templar fleet's capabilities remains frustratingly opaque, constituting one of the Order's greatest mysteries. Unlike their castles and banking records, evidence of their maritime operations is scant. They did not maintain a centralized navy but chartered ships as needed and operated from several ports. The sheer logistical challenge of coordinating the simultaneous escape of multiple large vessels from a watched harbor like La Rochelle is immense. Skeptics argue that while a ship or two might have slipped away, the disappearance of an entire fleet is an exaggeration born of legend. They suggest the ships were simply sold off or seized in various ports in the lead up to the arrests, their mundane fate ignored in favor of a more dramatic narrative. The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. It is entirely plausible that a core of high-ranking Templars, warned of the impending arrests, managed to commandeer a few key vessels laden with their most vital archives and treasures, escaping to a safe harbor like Scotland or Portugal, where the Order was simply absorbed into a new chivalric institution. The lost Templar fleet endures not because we have proof, but because it represents a final, defiant mystery, a last testament to the Order's ingenuity, and a permanent blank space on the map that invites us to imagine a different ending for the poor fellows of the Temple. We have sailed with vanished fleets and walked the empty streets of lost colonies, but some of the most compelling mysteries of the medieval world were not found on land or sea, but hanging in the sky above. Long before the age of airplanes and satellites, people looked up and witnessed things that defied all understanding, aerial phenomena so bizarre and vividly documented that they continue to fuel debate and wonder centuries later. These are not the vague rumors of peasants, but detailed accounts recorded by town clerks, monks, and artists, creating a historical record of the unexplained that feels startlingly modern. One of the most spectacular and well-documented of these events occurred over the free imperial city of Nuremberg in Germany on the morning of April 14, 1561. According to a broadsheet newspaper printed at the time, complete with a detailed woodcut illustration, the citizens were terrified by a celestial battle. At dawn, they saw a multitude of strange objects in the sky, blood red, blue, and black spheres, along with crescent shapes and cylindrical tubes. These objects, the account states, were seen fighting one another, as if engaged in a great aerial conflict right above the city. The broadsheet describes the spectacle lasting for an hour, with the objects moving wildly around the sun, before several of them were seen to crash to the earth in a great cloud of smoke, while others flew away into the distance. The event was interpreted by the town as a divine warning, a terrifying omen from God meant to encourage repentance. The meticulous nature of the report, complete with the date, location, and a visual reference, elevates it far beyond a simple folktale, presenting us with a genuine historical puzzle. Equally compelling is an event from 3 centuries earlier, recorded in the chronicle of the Benedictine monk John of Bromyard. In 1290, above the abbey at Ampleforth in England, a large, silver, disc-shaped object was said to have drifted slowly and silently across the sky, terrifying the brothers and local villagers who witnessed it. The monk's description is devoid of any religious symbolism or talk of angels and demons. It is a straightforward, almost clinical report of an unidentified aerial object with a clear physical description. This account feels particularly resonant because it lacks the layers of interpretation that often obscure medieval texts, presenting us with a raw observation that could easily be a report from a modern-day pilot. So how do we analyze these accounts? The first and most rational approach is to look for astronomical explanations. The Nuremberg event, for instance, bears a striking resemblance to a complex parhelion or sun dog. This is an atmospheric optical phenomenon that occurs when sunlight is refracted through ice crystals in high-altitude cirrus clouds. Under the right conditions, this can create the illusion of multiple suns, bright spots, and even luminous crosses in the sky. To a population with no knowledge of atmospheric science, a particularly vivid and rare sun dog could easily be interpreted as a battle of celestial spheres or crosses. Similarly, bright comets with their long, glowing tails, meteor showers, and even the intense, swirling lights of the aurora borealis, which can sometimes be seen much further south than usual, could account for many medieval sky wonders. These natural events are awe-inspiring even today. For a medieval observer, they must have been utterly terrifying and supernatural. Yet, the religious and cultural context of the time is just as important for understanding these reports. The medieval worldview was one where the spiritual and physical realms were intimately connected. The sky was not empty space, it was the heavens, the domain of God and his angels, but also a battlefield where the forces of good and evil clashed. Any unusual event was therefore filtered through a lens of divinity and omens. A strange light in the sky was not a weather phenomenon, it was a sign, a portent of war, plague, or divine displeasure. This interpretative framework is crucial. It doesn't mean people were lying or hallucinating. It means they were describing what they saw using the only vocabulary and understanding they had. An unusual cloud formation didn't just look like a ship. It was a spectral ship because that was a concept that existed in their world. This is why so many accounts, like Nuremberg, are framed as warnings and calls to prayer. The event's meaning was inseparable from its appearance. What makes these medieval sightings so endlessly fascinating is their uncanny resemblance to modern UFO reports. The descriptions of spheres, disks, and cylinders are familiar tropes in contemporary ufology. The behavior of these objects hovering silently, moving erratically, and engaging with each other mirrors thousands of accounts from the 20th and 21st centuries. This has led some to propose the controversial theory that these are not misinterpretations of natural events at all, but evidence of the same phenomenon observed across centuries. Proponents of this ancient astronaut theory argue that if people from different eras with completely different cultural backgrounds and technological understandings are describing the same thing, then perhaps they are indeed witnessing the same unexplained physical presence. However, a more nuanced perspective sees this similarity as evidence of the enduring patterns of human perception and storytelling. When confronted with the truly unknown, the human mind strives to make sense of it by comparing it to known objects. In the Middle Ages, the most advanced technology was seafaring and siege warfare. Hence, people saw celestial ships, glowing spears, and floating shields. In the 1940s, the cutting edge was aviation and rocketry. Hence, people saw flying wings and cigar-shaped rockets. Today, in our digital age, we often describe UFOs as silent, black triangles or tic-tacs, shapes that feel futuristic and technologically advanced to us. The phenomenon may be a constant, but the language we use to describe it is always shaped by the world we know. The medieval UFO sightings challenge us to disentangle the observation from the interpretation, to listen to what these ancient witnesses actually said they saw, and to wonder, despite all our modern knowledge, if some mysteries in the clouds remain just beyond our grasp. Imagine navigating the treacherous, grey expanse of the North Atlantic in an open longship, with no compass, no charts, and the sun completely hidden behind a dense, featureless ceiling of cloud for days on end. For most sailors of the medieval world, this would have been a death sentence, a sure path to becoming hopelessly lost and succumbing to the sea. Yet, the Norse Vikings performed this feat with astonishing regularity, venturing from their Scandinavian homelands to settle Iceland and Greenland, and even establishing a short-lived colony in Newfoundland they called Vinland, all centuries before Christopher Columbus set sail. How did they achieve such unparalleled navigational accuracy in such a hostile environment? The sagas hint at a secret weapon, a mysterious tool referred to as a solarstein, a sunstone. This was no mythical object. Modern science suggests it was a brilliantly simple, yet devastatingly effective, piece of natural technology that allowed them to see the invisible. The clues to this lost technology are embedded in the Icelandic sagas, those epic narratives that blend history and legend. In the saga of King Olaf, the hero Sigurd is challenged to locate the sun on a completely overcast day. The king holds up a crystal, and by looking through it, Sigurd is able to pinpoint the sun's location in the sky and thus determine the cardinal directions. Another saga, the Saga of St. Olaf, describes the weather during a crucial battle as so grim that the weather was thick and snowy, as Sigurd had said. When asked how he could possibly know the sun's position, he replies, "The sun tells me where she is." For a long time, historians dismissed these accounts as pure folklore, a magical explanation for the Vikings' incredible seafaring skills. But as we've learned to take these old tales more seriously, a compelling scientific theory has emerged, turning myth into a plausible historical reality. The leading candidate for the sunstone is a specific type of crystal known as Iceland spar, a remarkably clear form of calcite that possesses a unique optical property called birefringence, or double refraction. When a ray of light passes through this crystal, it is split into two separate beams. This means if you were to look at a single point through a piece of Iceland spar, you would see two images. The key to its use as a navigational aid lies in how it interacts with polarized light. Sunlight becomes polarized as it scatters through the Earth's atmosphere, forming a pattern that is invisible to the human eye but consistent and centered on the sun, even when it is obscured by cloud or fog. By holding the Iceland spar up to the sky and rotating it, a Viking navigator would be looking for a specific alignment. When the crystal is oriented correctly relative to this hidden polarization pattern, the two images seen through it become equal in intensity or darkness. This alignment would directly indicate the azimuth or horizontal direction of the sun, effectively revealing its position behind the clouds with a surprising degree of accuracy. This isn't just theoretical, it's been proven through rigorous experimental archaeology. In 2011, a team of researchers led by Guy Ropars conducted a landmark experiment. They used a precise piece of Iceland spar on an overcast day and were able to determine the sun's position with an accuracy of within 1 degree, a margin of error that is more than sufficient for ocean navigation. Even more compellingly, a crystal identified as Iceland spar was discovered on board an Elizabethan warship that sank in 1592, suggesting the technology or knowledge of it persisted long after the Viking Age. The Vikings, masters of practical innovation, wouldn't have needed to understand the complex physics of polarization. They simply needed to observe that this particular crystal, when used in a specific way, gave them reliable directional information when all other visual cues failed. It was a tool that turned the entire sky into a subtle compass. Of course, the sunstone was likely just one tool in a sophisticated navigational toolkit. The Vikings were master observers of their environment. They carefully tracked the migratory paths of whales and birds, knowing these creatures would lead them to land. They were experts in reading wave patterns and swell directions, which could indicate the proximity of islands or the mainland. They had a deep understanding of astronavigation, using star constellations when they were visible. The sunstone, however, was the key that unlocked the day, their primary method of staying on course during the long, overcast stretches that define North Atlantic travel. It was the technological edge that allowed them to push beyond the limits of coastal hopping and undertake true blue water voyages into the unknown. This humble crystal challenges our modern arrogance, reminding us that technological sophistication doesn't always mean microchips and digital readouts. Sometimes it means holding a piece of the earth itself up to the sky and learning to decipher the secrets written in the light. The Viking sunstone stands as a testament to human ingenuity, a perfect marriage of natural science and fearless exploration that changed the map of the world forever. At the very moment the Vikings were perfecting their navigation with sunstones to cross the North Atlantic on the opposite side of the globe, a maritime power was emerging that dwarfed all of Europe combined. This was the Ming Dynasty's treasure fleet, an armada of such colossal scale and sophistication that its sudden disappearance from the world stage remains one of history's most dramatic and puzzling reversals of fortune. At the heart of this mystery is the towering figure of Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who rose to become the greatest admiral in history, commanding a force that made the later voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama look like modest coastal excursions. The statistics of Zheng He's fleet are so staggering they border on the mythical, yet they are well documented. Between 1405 and 1433, he commanded 7 epic voyages across the Indian Ocean. His largest ships, the legendary treasure ships, were said to be over 400 feet long, nearly twice the length of a modern Olympic soccer field. Imagine a wooden vessel with 9 masts, her decks bustling with a crew of hundreds, her holds filled with priceless porcelain, silk, and gold to be bestowed upon foreign kings as gifts proclaiming the Ming Emperor's magnificence. These were not warships designed for conquest, but floating embassies of overwhelming power and generosity. The entire fleet could consist of over 300 ships of various types, including supply vessels, water tankers, and horse transports, carrying a total crew of 27,000 sailors, soldiers, merchants, and diplomats. This was not just a navy, it was a floating city, a projection of Chinese soft power that established trade routes, collected tribute, and brought giraffes from Africa back to the imperial court in Nanjing, where they were believed to be the mythical Kilin, auspicious omens of heaven's favor. Then, with shocking suddenness, it all stopped. After the 7th voyage, the mighty treasure ships were ordered to be destroyed. The shipyards that built them were shuttered. The meticulous logs, charts, and records of Zheng He's voyages were confiscated and burned by order of the court. China, which had possessed the means to dominate the globe, deliberately turned its back on the sea and retreated behind its own borders, initiating a period of isolationism that would last for centuries. The question is, why? What could possibly motivate an empire to voluntarily destroy its own overwhelming advantage and erase the evidence of its greatest achievements? The most widely accepted explanation points to a dramatic shift in imperial politics. The voyages were the pet project of the Yongle Emperor, a powerful and ambitious ruler who had usurped the throne and perhaps launched these extravagant missions to legitimize his rule and project his power abroad. After his death, a new faction came to power in the court, one dominated by conservative Confucian scholars. To these scholar officials, the voyages were a colossal waste of resources. They saw the treasure fleet not as a source of prestige, but as a bottomless pit draining the imperial treasury of silver and manpower that could be better spent defending the northern borders against persistent nomadic threats like the Mongols. They viewed the merchants and eunuchs who benefited from the voyages as corrupting influences, and they saw the outside world not as a place of opportunity, but as a source of barbarian contamination and unnecessary trouble. In their view, China was the celestial empire, self-sufficient and culturally complete. It had no need for the strange goods and stranger peoples of distant lands. The destruction of the fleet was for them a return to proper order and fiscal responsibility. This historical pivot, however, has fueled one of the most controversial and captivating theories in alternative history. The idea that the colossal reach of Zheng He's fleet extended far beyond the Indian Ocean and the coast of Africa, potentially all the way to the Americas, decades before Christopher Columbus. The theory is based on a tantalizing collection of circumstantial evidence. A copy of a map, allegedly from the early 15th century and now known as the Mao Kun map, is included in a 17th century treatise on armaments. This map, which some believe is based on the lost charts of Zheng He, shows detailed knowledge of the world from China to Africa. Proponents like author Gavin Menzies in his book 1421 argue that other, now lost charts showed the Americas. They point to alleged Chinese artifacts found on the west coasts of North and South America, unexplained shipwrecks, and similarities between Native American and Chinese cultures. The theory suggests that the records were destroyed not just to save money, but to hide a world-altering discovery that the isolationist court had no interest in pursuing. While the mainstream academic community overwhelmingly rejects the idea of a deliberate Ming Chinese colonization of the Americas, citing a lack of archaeological and documentary evidence, the core question remains profound. The loss of the treasure fleet was more than the scuttling of a few ships. It was the deliberate abandonment of a future. By turning inward, China ceded the age of exploration and the eventual rise of global trade networks to the nascent powers of Europe. The sea lanes that Zheng He had mastered soon bustled with Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships, whose smaller, nimbler vessels were armed for conquest and trade in a way the Ming treasure ships never were. The mystery of the lost Chinese fleet is therefore a haunting historical what if. It forces us to contemplate a world where the flow of ideas, technology, and power might have moved from east to west, and to wonder how different the modern world might look if the Celestial Empire had chosen to keep sailing. We have navigated by unseen sunstones and sailed with vast, vanished armadas, but now we must step out of the realm of ships and stars and into a most peculiar courtroom, one where the defendants are not human. Picture a solemn ecclesiastical court in the French countryside, a panel of grim-faced judges in robes, and a prosecutor meticulously laying out his case. The crime, the murder of an infant, the accused, a full-grown sow and her 6 piglets. This is not a scene from a satirical novel or a fever dream. This was a genuine and shockingly common practice throughout medieval and early modern Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, from the 9th to the 19th century, animals were formally tried, convicted, and executed for crimes ranging from trespass and destruction of property to assault and murder, in proceedings that mirrored human trials in every punctilious detail. The case of the Savigny pigs in 1457 is one of the most thoroughly documented. After a swine was found guilty of eating part of a child's face and arms, the mother sow was arrested and tried as an accomplice. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Her piglets, however, were acquitted due to their youth, the insufficiency of evidence, and the bad example they had received from their mother, and were returned to their owner. The execution itself was a public spectacle, with the sow dressed in a waistcoat, breeches, and white gloves, a detail that speaks volumes about the need to anthropomorphize the animal, to make it resemble a human criminal before subjecting it to a human punishment. But pigs were far from the only creatures hauled before the bar. In 1522, the town of Autun in France prosecuted a group of rats for destroying the barley crop. The court appointed a defense lawyer for the rodents, who argued eloquently that his clients had been given insufficient notice to appear for the summons due to the constant threat posed by the town's cats. When the rats failed to present themselves in court after a second, safer summons was issued, the case was dismissed. In another instance, a parish in Switzerland excommunicated a swarm of flies that was plaguing the area, and dolphins have been tried for acts of piracy. To our modern sensibilities, this seems like the height of absurdity, a spectacle of superstitious nonsense. But to dismiss it as such is to miss the profound and complex worldview that made these trials not just logical but necessary. The medieval conception of the universe was a great chain of being, a divinely ordained hierarchy that stretched from God and the angels down through kings, nobles, peasants, animals, plants, and minerals. Every link in this chain had its place and its purpose. Humans occupied a unique position, straddling the spiritual and physical worlds, possessing both a soul and a beastly body. Animals were seen as being lower on this chain, but they were still part of God's created order and therefore subject to his laws. If an animal transgressed its natural role, if a pig, whose purpose was to be raised and eaten, turned and ate a human, it wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a rupture in the divine order, a rebellion against God's plan that echoed the original rebellion of Satan. This act of animal violence was a form of blasphemy, a pollution that stained the entire community. The formal, legalistic ritual of a trial was not for the animal's benefit, it was a societal exorcism. It was a way for the community to reassert control, to cleanse itself of the spiritual stain, and to publicly demonstrate that divine order had been restored through the might of the law. The animal's body became a symbol of chaos, and its execution was a symbolic sacrifice to appease an angry God and restore harmony. This practice also reveals a fascinating, almost animistic belief in animal agency that our modern scientific worldview has largely erased. Medieval people did not see animals as mere automatons operating purely on instinct. They believed that animals, having been present in the Garden of Eden and on Noah's Ark, were conscious participants in the cosmic struggle between good and evil. They possessed a form of reason, albeit a lesser one than humans, and were therefore capable of making moral choices. An animal that committed a crime was not just dangerous, it was wicked. It had willingly chosen to succumb to its baser nature and ally itself with the forces of chaos and sin. This is why the trials were conducted with such excruciating legal precision. Lawyers were appointed, witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and sentences were meticulously written down. The process had to be fair by the standards of the time, because they were not just punishing a beast, they were judging a moral agent that had voluntarily broken a sacred covenant. The slow decline of the animal trials came with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. As thinkers like Descartes began to posit that animals were merely complex machines without souls or reason, Bert's machines, the entire philosophical foundation for putting them on trial collapsed. If an animal was just a faulty mechanism, then its actions required a mechanical fix, not a spiritual judgment. A dangerous pig should be slaughtered and disposed of, not dressed in human clothes and given a state-sanctioned hanging. The law began to concern itself solely with the animal's owner and matters of civil liability for damages. The last known animal trial in Europe was held in Switzerland in 1906, not for a pig or a rat, but for a man's dog that was accused of murdering its owner. It feels like a distant, bizarre echo of a world that had already passed. The medieval animal trials stand as a stark and strange monument to a time when the universe was alive with meaning, when every event was a potential message from God, and when the line between the human and the natural world was not a sharp divide, but a blurred and contested border where pigs could be found guilty of murder and flies could be found in contempt of court. While Europe was often mired in its so-called Dark Ages, a brilliant flame of intellectual and scientific progress was burning brightly in the East. From the 8th to the 14th centuries, the Islamic world experienced a golden age, a period of unprecedented scholarly achievement that gathered the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, Persians, and Indians, refined it, and then advanced it in leaps and bounds that would not be matched for centuries. Think of this era as a vast and intricate library, a repository of human knowledge so advanced that it contained ideas we are only now rediscovering. But this library suffered catastrophic losses. Fires of war, shifting political winds, and the simple ravages of time conspired to ensure that a staggering amount of this knowledge never made the full journey into the European Renaissance, creating one of history's most profound intellectual voids. The scale of this loss is almost incomprehensible, and its primary catalyst was one of the most devastating events in human history, the Mongol invasions. In 1258, the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, laid siege to Baghdad, the dazzling capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and the undisputed intellectual heart of the Islamic world. The city was home to the famed House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah. This was not merely a library in the modern sense, it was a massive academy, a translation bureau, and a research institute where scholars of all faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, worked together to translate every philosophical and scientific text they could acquire from across the known world into Arabic. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, they built upon it, conducting groundbreaking experiments and writing their own revolutionary treatises. When the Mongols finally breached the city's defenses, they embarked on a methodical campaign of destruction. It is said that the waters of the Tigris River ran black with the ink from the countless manuscripts thrown into its depths and red with the blood of the scholars and citizens slaughtered. The House of Wisdom was utterly eradicated, and with it, an incalculable treasury of human understanding was lost forever. While some knowledge had already spread to other centers like Cairo and Cordoba, the destruction of Baghdad was a decapitation strike against the very engine of medieval science. Consider the field of medicine, where the loss is particularly acute. We know the name Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a foundational text for centuries. But what of the works that didn't survive? Abu Bakr al-Razi, a brilliant clinician and chemist, wrote over 200 books. While some survive, many of his most detailed case studies and experimental findings are gone. Even more tragically, we have only fragments of the work of Ibn al-Nafis, a 13th century physician from Damascus who, centuries before William Harvey, described the pulmonary circulation of blood, how it travels to the lungs to be oxygenated before returning to the heart. His complete commentary, Shah Tashri al-Kanon, which contained this revolutionary idea, was largely unknown in the West. Imagine how the history of medicine might have accelerated if Harvey had had access to al-Nafis's full work instead of having to rediscover the principle himself. The gap in astronomy and mathematics is equally staggering. The Maraghe Observatory in 13th century Persia, under the directorship of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, was one of the most advanced scientific institutions the world had ever seen. Its scholars developed incredibly precise planetary models and compiled star catalogues far more accurate than anything in Europe at the time. Al-Tusi himself created the Tusi couple, a mathematical theorem that provided a solution for linear motion from circular motions. This very idea was later used by Copernicus in his model of a heliocentric universe, and historians fiercely debate whether he had access to Al-Tusi's work or was forced to independently arrive at the same complex conclusion centuries later. The possibility that Copernicus stood on the shoulders of giants whose names he never knew is a haunting one. Furthermore, the works of the Banu Musa brothers, 3 9th century scholars in Baghdad, detailed complex automatons and mechanical devices that seemed to presage the principles of robotics. Their book of ingenious devices survived, but how many other manuals of forgotten engineering marvels were consumed in the flames of fallen libraries? What modern science might have gained from these missing texts is a question that fuels both historians and scientists. The methodological approach of these Islamic scholars was in many ways strikingly modern. They emphasized empirical evidence, repeated experimentation, and peer review, a process known as AIMA or consensus. They were pioneering the very scientific method that Europe would later claim as its own invention. Had the full corpus of their work, their failures as well as their successes made it west, the entire timeline of human progress might look radically different. The Renaissance could have begun 200 years earlier. The fundamental laws of physics and motion explored by Newton might have been established by an Ibn Sina or an Al-Haytham. The loss is not just of facts and figures, but of entire pathways of thought, of alternative ways of seeing the universe that were snuffed out. The Islamic Golden Age represents a breathtaking road not taken, a parallel timeline of human achievement that was tragically cut short, leaving us to forever wonder what other secrets were lost in the dust of fallen cities and the dark, ink-stained waters of the Tigris. While Europe's scholars debated the culpability of pigs and its sailors feared ghost ships, the very climate beneath their feet was shifting in a way that would redefine empires and then erase them without a trace. For 300 years, from roughly 950 to 1250, the world experienced a profound meteorological aberration that historians and scientists now call the medieval climate anomaly. This was not a subtle shift, it was a dramatic warming period that redrew the map of what was possible for human civilization, creating a golden age for some and a crushing oblivion for others, all before the climate once again tightened its icy grip. The evidence for this period of unusual warmth is written not in parchment, but in the very fabric of the natural world. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, have compiled a meticulous diary of the past by examining ancient wood from oaks and pines. The rings from this 3-century span are consistently wider, indicating longer, warmer growing seasons with abundant rainfall. Meanwhile, in the frozen expanses of Greenland and Antarctica, glaciologists drilled deep into ice sheets to extract core samples. These icy time capsules contain layers of compacted snow that fell centuries ago. By analyzing the chemical composition of these layers, specifically the ratio of oxygen isotopes, scientists can reconstruct past temperatures with remarkable accuracy. The ice cores confirm what the tree rings suggest. The world was significantly warmer, with some estimates suggesting average temperatures in the North Atlantic were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius higher than in the preceding and following centuries. This seemingly small number had an outsized, transformative impact on daily life across the globe. Nowhere was this impact more dramatically felt than in the far north, where the warming climate opened a door to expansion that the Vikings rushed through with characteristic ambition. The North Atlantic, usually a forbidding gauntlet of icebergs and storms, became a more navigable highway. This allowed Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, to discover and settle a vast new land he shrewdly named Greenland to attract settlers. For a few centuries, the name was not entirely a marketing gimmick. The two settlements, the eastern and western fjords, thrived. Farmers raised cattle and sheep on pastures that today are locked in permafrost. They exported walrus ivory, wool, and hides back to Europe, building a complex society with its own bishopric and a population that peaked at an estimated 5,000 people. The warmer seas also teemed with cod and haddock, supporting a robust coastal life. This entire Norse civilization in Greenland was a direct product of the medieval climate anomaly, a precarious foothold in a polar world that was only temporarily hospitable. The effects were equally pronounced in the heart of Europe, transforming its agricultural and economic landscape. In England, which had a reputation for being cold, wet, and better suited to raising sheep than grapes, the warming trend sparked a viticulture boom. Vineyards flourished as far north as Yorkshire, producing wines that were reportedly of good quality and even exported. Monasteries, the economic powerhouses of the medieval world, expanded their farmlands higher into hills and further north than had previously been feasible. Crop yields increased, famines became less frequent, and the general abundance supported a population boom that fueled the construction of the great cathedrals and the growth of bustling cities. The prosperous, expansive Europe of the High Middle Ages, often credited to political and technological advances, was in no small part built on a foundation of reliably good weather. But what caused this centuries-long heat wave? Scientists point to a confluence of natural factors, a perfect storm of celestial and terrestrial mechanics. A primary suspect is a significant increase in solar activity, a period known as the medieval solar maximum. Sunspot records from the time, along with subsequent analysis of beryllium-10 isotopes in ice cores, indicate the sun was particularly active, emitting more energy and bathing the Earth in heightened warmth. Compounding this was a pronounced lull in major volcanic activity. Large volcanic eruptions inject vast quantities of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere, where they reflect sunlight back into space and cool the planet. The relative volcanic quiet of this era meant there was no natural counterbalance to the sun's increased output. Furthermore, ocean current patterns, particularly the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, may have been in a warm phase, pumping additional heat into the atmosphere and influencing weather patterns across Europe and North America. The story of the medieval climate anomaly, however, is not one of unending prosperity. It is a cautionary tale about building a civilization on a climate niche. By the late 13th century, the pendulum began to swing back. Solar activity decreased, and a series of massive volcanic eruptions, including one in 1257 that was likely the Samalas eruption in Indonesia, spewed enough reflective particles into the atmosphere to trigger global cooling. This marked the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of advancing glaciers, failed harvests, and relentless storms. The Viking settlements in Greenland, so dependent on marginal farming and seal hunting, found themselves trapped. The sea ice expanded, cutting off trade routes to Iceland and Europe. The growing season shortened until it was impossible to sustain enough livestock to survive the winters. The once green pastures vanished under snow and ice. By the mid-15th century, the Norse presence in Greenland was extinct, not conquered, but simply starved and frozen out of existence by a changing climate they could not control or escape. This forgotten period of medieval warming is far more than a historical curiosity. It is a crucial case study for understanding our own climate predicament today. It demonstrates the profound vulnerability of human societies to even modest shifts in global temperature. It shows that climate change is not a future threat, but a recurring character in the human story, capable of enabling golden ages and orchestrating collapses. The crucial difference, of course, is the cause. The medieval climate anomaly was driven by natural variability, the sun, the volcanoes, the oceans. Our current warming trend is overwhelmingly driven by human activity, the rapid emission of greenhouse gases from industry and agriculture. Studying the medieval warm period allows scientists to better separate natural climate variability from human-caused change, refining the models that predict our future. It serves as a powerful reminder that climate is never a stable backdrop for human history, but an active, volatile participant. The Norse in Greenland learned that lesson too late, leaving behind only stone ruins buried in ice as a stark monument to a world that grew warm and then grew cold. Imagine a stage not of wood and velvet, but of rolling pageant wagons rumbling through the crowded, cobblestone streets of a medieval city. On these makeshift platforms, the entire cosmic drama of human existence was performed for an audience of thousands, from the creation of the world to the final, fiery day of judgment. This was the vibrant, sprawling world of medieval theater, a tradition so vast and so deeply woven into the fabric of community life that it constituted a second scripture, one written not in Latin but in action, song, and the shared imagination of an entire populace. And yet, for all its scale and significance, the vast majority of this creative explosion has been utterly lost to us, leaving behind only tantalizing fragments of what was once a living, breathing encyclopedia of faith, humor, and social commentary. These performances fell into several grand categories, each with its own purpose. The most spectacular were the mystery plays, also known as cycle plays. These were not single performances, but massive, community-wide undertakings, often produced by the powerful trade guilds of a city. Each guild would be responsible for a specific biblical episode, crafting both the pageant wagon and the performance. The shipwrights might stage Noah's Ark, complete with a functional wooden boat. The bakers might take on the Last Supper, and the goldsmiths the Adoration of the Magi. The entire cycle could take days to perform, moving from station to station throughout the town, transforming the urban landscape itself into a sacred space. The surviving texts from places like York, Chester, Wakefield, and Coventry are literary treasures, but they represent a mere handful of the hundreds of such cycles that once existed across England and continental Europe. For every York cycle that made it to the printing press, there were a dozen others from towns like Lincoln, Dublin, or Bristol that vanished entirely, their scripts likely worn to tatters from use or lost when the Reformation turned against such elaborate Catholic traditions. Alongside these biblical epics were the morality plays, which turned inward to explore the landscape of the human soul. These were allegorical dramas where the main character was not a biblical figure but an everyman, and the supporting cast were personifications of virtues and vices like charity, gluttony, knowledge, and death. The most famous survivor is Everyman, a powerful and stark play where the protagonist is summoned by death and must find a companion to accompany him to the grave, only to be abandoned by all but good deeds. This single, brilliant play is just a glimpse into what was likely a rich genre exploring ethical dilemmas and spiritual anxiety. How many other profound allegories were performed in town squares, using clever stagecraft to make abstract concepts like avarice or repentance into tangible, memorable characters? Their loss means we have lost a crucial window into how ordinary medieval people conceptualized their own internal moral struggles. Then there was the world of secular folk drama, the most ephemeral of all. These were the rustic performances for village holidays, the raucous mummers' plays performed at Christmas and Easter, and the satirical farces that mocked social conventions. They were rarely, if ever, written down, existing as a living oral tradition passed from one generation of players to the next. We catch fleeting, frustrating glimpses of them in church condemnation decrees and civic account books that note payments for props or costumes. A record might mention a payment for the players of the summer game or for making the giant, but the scripts themselves are gone. These performances were the beating heart of popular culture, full of bawdy humor, symbolic battles between good and evil, often represented by St. George and a boastful knight, and rituals meant to ensure fertility and good fortune for the coming year. Their complete disappearance means we have lost the medieval world's own voice, its jokes, its subversive wit, and its connection to traditions that likely stretched back into pre-Christian times. What do these fragments and absences tell us? They reveal a society that was far from the dour, piety-obsessed caricature. The surviving plays are bursting with life, humor, and astonishing humanity. In the Wakefield cycle, the sheep-stealing shepherds complaining about their wives and the bitter cold feel like real people, their dialogue sharp and earthy long before they witnessed the miracle of the Nativity. This was not a theater of distant reverence, but one of immediate engagement. The loss of so much of this material means we have lost a critical tool for understanding medieval literacy. For the vast majority of people, these plays were the Bible. They were the primary way they learned the stories of their faith, not through a priest's Latin sermon, but through a vivid, vernacular, and often comedic performance. Thematically, the erasure of these works has flattened our view of medieval thought. We are left with the official, theological texts written by the educated elite, but we have lost the vibrant, messy, and democratic counterpoint. The people's theology performed in the street, full of doubt, anachronism, and a deeply relatable human wonder. The silence where these plays once echoed is a profound one, a reminder that history is not just what was saved by time and chance, but also the immense, colorful, and noisy world of what was allowed to fade away. Yet even as communities gathered to watch biblical stories unfold on pageant wagons, in the workshops of master metalsmiths, a very different kind of drama was being forged, one of fire, iron, and earth-shattering power. The 15th century witnessed the birth of true leviathans of warfare, colossal superguns, bombards of such immense size and destructive capability that they were less like weapons and more like mobile monuments to a kingdom's might. These were not merely large cannons, they were feats of engineering that pushed the very limits of contemporary metallurgy and logistics, and their sudden, near-total disappearance from the battlefields of Europe is a technological mystery that echoes as loudly as their thunderous shots once did. To understand the scale of these weapons, consider Mons Meg, the Scottish bombard that still resides at Edinburgh Castle. Built in 1449 on the orders of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, and gifted to King James II of Scotland, she is a monster of wrought iron. Her barrel is over 13 feet long, and her bore diameter is a staggering 20 inches wide, enough to fire a stone cannonball weighing nearly 400 pounds a distance of over 2 miles. The construction of such a beast was a monumental undertaking. Her barrel was not cast in a single piece. That technology was still in its infancy. Instead, she was built like a barrel herself, from long, rectangular iron bars arranged radially around a central mandrel and then hooped together with massive, heat-shrunk iron rings like the staves of a titanic wooden cask. Forging each of these components required the coordinated effort of a team of blacksmiths working a massive furnace and trip hammers, their skill ensuring the iron fused perfectly under incredible heat and pressure. The secret knowledge lay in the quality of the iron and the precise tempering of the rings. A single flaw in the welding process could create a catastrophic weak point, turning the gun into a bomb for its own crew. The purpose of these superguns was rarely tactical. They were too slow, too cumbersome, and too expensive to fire to be used in a fast-moving battle. Their value was overwhelmingly psychological and strategic. They were siege weapons par excellence, designed to pound the strongest medieval castles into submission. The mere sight of a bombard like the Ottoman Empire's infamous Dardanelles gun, which could fire a 700-pound stone ball rolling up to a city's walls, was often enough to prompt a swift surrender. The sound of its shot was described as a thunderclap that could shatter glass windows over a mile away, and the impact of its projectile could reduce towering stone battlements to rubble in a handful of shots. They were instruments of terror, tangible proof that no wall was high enough or thick enough to defy the will of the monarch who commanded such power. They were the ultimate diplomatic tool, a blunt argument that few city governors were willing to ignore, and then within a century they were gone. By the mid-16th century, the era of the giant wrought iron bombard was effectively over. The reasons for their rapid obsolescence are a fascinating mix of evolving military strategy and advancing technology. The first and most practical reason was mobility, or rather, the crippling lack of it. Transporting Mons Meg from her fabrication in Mons, Belgium, to Scotland was a Herculean effort that required a team of oxen, dozens of carts disassembled for the journey, and a small army of workers to clear roads and reinforce bridges. Once on the battlefield, moving her even short distances was a logistical nightmare. This lack of strategic mobility made them white elephants, incredibly powerful, but too slow to be useful in the rapidly shifting campaigns of the Renaissance. The second reason was a revolution in firearms technology itself. The very metallurgical advances that had made the bombards possible soon rendered them obsolete. The development of reliable cast bronze cannon and later cast iron allowed for the production of stronger, lighter, and more durable barrels that could withstand the pressure of more powerful corned gunpowder. This new powder burned more consistently and violently than the older serpentine powder, which was prone to separating into its components and burning unevenly. The new cannons could fire smaller, denser iron shot with far greater velocity and accuracy than a bombard could launch a giant stone ball. A battery of these newer, more mobile cannons could achieve the same destructive effect as a single supergun, but could be repositioned easily and fired much more rapidly. Why waste resources on a single, monumental shot when you could have 20 faster, more accurate ones? Finally, there is the intriguing possibility that the knowledge to maintain these specific guns was simply lost. The master blacksmiths who forged them possessed secrets of welding and tempering that were likely passed down orally through apprenticeships. As the demand for their unique skills vanished, replaced by the founders who cast cannon, this specialized knowledge may have died with them. A gun like Mons Meg might have developed a crack or a flaw after decades of service. and with no one left who understood the precise art of repairing a giant wrought iron barrel built from dozens of individual pieces, she would have been retired from service, becoming a ceremonial relic rather than a functional weapon. This combination of factors, strategic impracticality, technological disruption, and lost artisanal knowledge sealed the fate of the medieval superguns. They vanished from history not with a bang but a whimper, their thunderous voices silenced by the relentless march of progress, leaving behind only their silent, imposing forms as reminders of a brief, terrifying age when the biggest gun truly was the king of the battlefield. While the thunder of superguns faded into history, a far quieter but no less revolutionary kind of power was being meticulously drawn onto parchment, the power of knowledge, of knowing what lies beyond the horizon. Tucked away in the great libraries and royal treasuries of the late medieval world were maps that defy our assumptions about the limits of exploration, charts so accurate and so perplexing that their origins remain one of history's most captivating intellectual puzzles. These are the Portolan charts, and their sudden appearance on the scene represents a leap in geographic understanding so dramatic it seems to have no clear precursor, as if the medieval world suddenly gained access to a satellite image of the seas. The word Portolan comes from the Italian portolano, meaning a pilot's book or guide, but these were far more than simple written instructions. The earliest surviving examples, like the Carta Pisana from the late 13th century, are stunning works of art and science. Drawn on vellum with exquisite care, they are covered in a mesmerizing spider web of room lines, straight lines radiating from compass roses that crisscross the chart, allowing a navigator to plot a course from any port to any other port by simply aligning a ruler. The coastlines of the Mediterranean and Black Seas are rendered with an accuracy that would not be surpassed for centuries, with every bay, river mouth, and promontory meticulously detailed. This is the heart of the mystery. How did medieval cartographers achieve such precision? The prevailing theory points to the accumulation of knowledge from countless anonymous mariners. For generations, sailors had been keeping detailed written logs called portolani, noting compass bearings, estimated distances, and descriptions of landmarks. A master chartmaker, perhaps in a trading hub like Genoa or Majorca, would have synthesized thousands of these individual reports into a single, coherent geographic vision. It was a crowdsourced project centuries before the term existed, a collective cognitive map of the sea made physical. Yet, the jump from written descriptions to such a perfectly scaled visual representation still feels almost miraculous, suggesting a level of mathematical and geometric skill that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. The intrigue deepens considerably when we look at charts that seem to show lands no European was supposed to have seen. The most famous and controversial of these is the Vinland map. Unveiled to the world with great fanfare in 1965, this map appears to be a 15th century world map drawn on medieval-style vellum. What made it a sensation was an inscription in the North Atlantic labeling a large island as Vinlandia Insula, accompanied by text describing how it was visited by Bjarni and Leif Erikson. If genuine, it would be the first known cartographic representation of the North American continent, created decades before Columbus's voyage and providing stunning corroboration for the Icelandic sagas. The academic world immediately split into warring camps. The initial paleographic analysis, the study of the script, suggested it was consistent with a 15th century hand. But then science entered the fray. Analysis of the ink revealed the presence of anatase, a particular crystalline form of titanium dioxide that was not commercially produced until the 1920s. For most historians, this was the smoking gun that proved the map a brilliant, modern forgery, perhaps created to deceive a collector. Yet the debate has never fully died. Proponents of the map's authenticity have counter-argued that anatase could occur naturally in medieval inks as a result of the chemical processes used to create them from iron gall. The vellum itself has been carbon dated to the correct period, around 1440. The question remains, is it a genuine medieval document that somehow contains an anachronistic compound, or is it an astonishingly clever fake that managed to source 500-year-old vellum for its deception? The Vinland map stands as a perfect emblem of this entire field of study, a tantalizing glimpse of a possibility that remains just out of reach, its truth obscured by a cloud of scientific and historical uncertainty. Beyond this one infamous example, other charts hint at a wider, whispered geographical knowledge. The Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral, famously includes a rough outline of the coast of South America. While not medieval, it is based on sources Reis himself claims were drawn in the time of Alexander the Great, a typical cartographic boast that nonetheless suggests he was consulting older, now lost maps. Even more intriguing are charts like the Yale University-owned Vinland map or the Cantino planisphere of 1502, which show a large phantom island called Antillia out in the Atlantic, often accompanied by smaller islands with names like Satanas. Some have theorized these could be distorted memories of actual voyages to the Azores or even the Caribbean, preserved in mapmakers' traditions long after the original voyages were forgotten. Were these cartographic ghosts mere mythical places, similar to the Isles of the Blessed in classical literature, or were they the faded echoes of real landfalls made by unknown Basque, Bristolian, or Portuguese fishermen who had stumbled upon the Grand Banks of Newfoundland but kept their lucrative fishing grounds a closely guarded secret? The maps don't provide answers, only cryptic clues. Ultimately, the lost medieval maps force us to reconsider the narrative of the Age of Discovery. We are taught that exploration was a linear progression from ignorance to knowledge, a big bang that started with Columbus in 1492. These charts suggest a different story, one of fits and starts, of discoveries made and then forgotten, of knowledge that circulated in the closed circles of sailors and chartmakers long before it was ever deemed important enough for the history books. They hint at a pre-Columbian world that was far more interconnected, or at least aware of its possibilities, than we have traditionally believed. The Portolan charts were not just navigational tools, they were the cutting-edge artificial intelligence of their day, data visualization systems that synthesized countless points of information into a usable form. Their accuracy is a testament to the power of shared human observation, while their mysteries are a permanent reminder that the past is never as simple as it seems, and that some of history's greatest discoveries may have been mapped, celebrated, and then simply lost to time, waiting for us to find them again. We think of plastic surgery as a purely modern luxury, the domain of Beverly Hills clinics and cutting-edge medical technology. But the roots of rebuilding the human face after trauma are far older and more profound, reaching back into the very heart of the medieval world. In an era we often wrongly dismiss as uniformly superstitious and surgically primitive, a family of Sicilian barber surgeons achieved something that borders on the miraculous. They learned how to give people a new nose, and in doing so, they restored not just a face, but a person's very place in society. This is the story of the Brancas of Sicily, masters of a medical art so advanced it would be lost for 100 years, only to be painfully rediscovered. The need for such a procedure was tragically common in the 15th century. Syphilis, though often cited, was not the primary culprit at this time. That pandemic would arrive later. The true scourges were far more brutal and immediate. Warfare was constant and punishment was merciless. A soldier could have his nose severed by a sword stroke in battle. More commonly, judicial punishments for crimes like adultery, theft, or heresy often involved amputation of the nose. A person without a nose was marked for life, an outcast shunned by society, unable to earn a living or participate in community life. Their disfigurement was a permanent, walking advertisement of their shame or misfortune. It was into this world of suffering that the Branca family brought their extraordinary skill. The patriarch of this surgical dynasty was Gustavo Branca, working in the town of Catania around 1440. His great innovation was what we now call the Italian method of rhinoplasty, a technique so sophisticated it laid the foundation for the procedures still used today. His son, Antonio, perfected it, and the knowledge was passed down as a fiercely guarded family secret. Their technique was a masterpiece of practical ingenuity. They would not have understood germ theory, but they practiced a form of antiseptic surgery using wine as a disinfectant. They had no modern anesthetics, but they used sedative herbs and likely alcohol to dull the agonizing pain of the procedure. What they did next was nothing short of genius. The Brancas understood the concept of a pedicle flap, a section of skin that remains attached to the body to maintain its blood supply while it is moved to a new location. For a new nose, they turned not to some distant part of the body, but to the patient's own upper arm. The procedure was a two-stage affair, requiring immense fortitude from the patient. First, the surgeon would carefully prepare the raw, scarred stump on the face where the nose had been. Then he would take a small, sharp knife and cut a flap of skin from the patient's upper arm, but leave it attached at the bottom. This arm flap was then carefully sutured to the patient's face. The patient would then have to remain in a painfully contorted position for weeks, with their arms strapped to their head, as the skin graft slowly took root and established a new blood supply from the face. Once this connection was secure, the second stage commenced. The surgeon would sever the flap's connection to the arm, sculpt the new tissue into the shape of a nose, and craft nostrils. Contemporary accounts suggest they even used tubes of hardened wax to keep the new airways open during healing. The result was a functional, living nose made from the patient's own skin. For a time, the Branca family's secret art flourished in Sicily, but knowledge in the medieval world was fragile, often held in the hands of a few individuals and transmitted orally. As the Branca line eventually faded, their precise techniques seemed to have vanished from mainstream European medicine. It wasn't lost entirely. It likely persisted in isolated pockets of practical knowledge whispered among a few skilled surgeons. But to the wider academic and medical community, the idea of reconstructing a nose became a forgotten fantasy. The rediscovery of this lost art is a story in itself, one that highlights the strange journey of knowledge. In the 16th century, the Venetian surgeon Gaspar Tagliacozzi, working in Bologna, developed a remarkably similar technique. Historians have long debated whether Tagliacozzi independently invented his method or if he had somehow gotten wind of the Branca family's work through the medical grapevine. His procedure was slightly different, using a flap of skin from the patient's bicep rather than the upper arm, but the principle of the pedicle flap was identical. Tagliacozzi was a scholar, and he did something the Brancas apparently never did. He published his findings. In 1597, his comprehensive work De Catorum Chirurgia per Incisionum on the surgery of mutilation by grafting was released, complete with detailed illustrations. It was a sensation, but also his undoing. The Church, uncomfortable with what it saw as man tampering with God's judgment, condemned his work. After his death, he was even exhumed from consecrated ground. With this condemnation, the practice was once again pushed to the fringes, and the brilliant light of reconstructive surgery flickered and nearly died out for a second time. It would take until the 19th century and the advent of modern antiseptic surgery for these techniques to be fully embraced and refined. The story of medieval rhinoplasty is a powerful testament to human ingenuity in the face of suffering, but it is also a sobering reminder of how easily knowledge can be lost, buried by dogma, secrecy, and the simple passage of time. Imagine the great hall of a stone castle, the air thick with wood smoke and anticipation. A hush falls over the assembled knights and ladies as a figure steps into the firelight. This is the troubadour, a poet-musician from the sun-drenched lands of southern France, and he is about to perform not just a song, but a revolution. Strumming a viol or plucking a lute, he begins to sing of finema refined, courtly love. This is not the epic of a warrior's battle prowess, but the intimate, aching vulnerability of a knight's devotion to a noble lady, an emotion so powerful it could elevate him to spiritual perfection or destroy him with its intensity. For 2 centuries, from roughly 1100 to 1300, these troubadours and their northern counterparts, the trouvers, composed many thousands of songs that became the soundtrack of European aristocracy. Their words, meticulously copied by scribes onto costly parchment, survive in beautiful illuminated manuscripts called chansonniers. We have the poems, the stories, the names of the composers, but the music itself, the very thing that gave these words their power, is almost entirely lost. The manuscripts contain the lyrics, but for the vast majority of these songs, the musical notation is absent, leaving behind a haunting silence where melody should be. This is one of the most profound losses in the history of Western music, the lost songs of the troubadours. The reason for this monumental gap in our cultural record lies in the nature of the tradition itself. Troubadour music was primarily an oral art form, passed directly from master to apprentice, from performer to audience through sound and memory. The primary technology for preservation was not the page, but the human ear. In a world where musical literacy was confined to the church, the complex, fluid melodies of secular songs were considered ephemeral, meant for the moment of performance, not for eternity. The scribes who painstakingly wrote down the words were often clerics who either could not notate the music, did not have access to the melodies, or perhaps did not deem the secular tunes worthy of the same preservation as sacred Gregorian chant. The few chansonniers that do include musical notation, such as the magnificent Occitan manuscript known as F, are precious but rare exceptions, preserving a tiny fraction of the repertoire. For the rest, we are left with the ghost of the performance, the skeleton of the text without the flesh and blood of the melody that brought it to life. It is as if we have the libretto for an opera but have lost every single note of the score. This silence has not stopped musicians and scholars from attempting one of history's most fascinating acts of artistic archaeology, the reconstruction of these lost melodies. The quest begins with the few surviving notated songs, which provide a crucial key to the musical language of the time. The scales or modes used, the rhythmic patterns, and the intricate flowing vocal styles. From this foundation, musicians look for clues embedded within the poems themselves. The structure of a lyric is a map, the number of syllables per line, the rhyme scheme, and the repetition of certain words or phrases all suggest a corresponding musical structure. A repeating refrain in the poem almost certainly would have been set to a repeating melodic phrase. The very cadence and rhythm of the language, when spoken aloud, can hint at the natural rhythm and emphasis a melody might have taken. Performers then draw upon the living traditions of folk music from the regions where the troubadours worked, from the oral traditions of Corsica or the Balearic Islands, whose ancient styles may hold echoes of those medieval forms. The result is not a definitive recreation. We can never know for certain if we have it right, but rather an informed and deeply felt interpretation, a bridge built across 8 centuries to reconnect word and music. What we stand to gain from this musical detective work is nothing less than a new dimension for understanding the medieval mind. Text alone can tell us about the ideals of courtly love, the politics of the era, and the structure of society. But music is the language of emotion. The same line of poetry sung in a joyous major mode or a haunting, melancholic one completely changes its meaning and emotional impact. The lost melodies hold the key to the true emotional tenor of the age, the raw passion, the deep sorrow, the playful wit that the written word can only point toward. The musical setting would have told us how a listener was supposed to feel when they heard about the lover's parting or the lady's cruelty. Furthermore, this music was a social glue. The performance of these songs in a court was a communal event that reinforced social bonds, defined cultural values, and provided a shared emotional experience. The melody, the instrumentation, the very act of singing together created an atmosphere that the text alone cannot replicate. By losing the music, we have lost the emotional heartbeat of medieval courtly life, the shared soundscape that shaped the inner lives of an entire class of people. The lost songs of the troubadours are a reminder that history is not just written in texts and treaties, but in the ephemeral, beautiful, and devastatingly human art of song, a truth that resonates all the more powerfully because of its silence. What if the flicker of electric light was not a product of the modern era, but a technology that had its brief, forgotten dawn over 2,000 years ago, only to be lost for centuries? This is the startling premise behind one of archaeology's most controversial and electrifying puzzles. In 1936, workers excavating for a railway line near Baghdad, in what was once ancient Mesopotamia, unearthed a most peculiar set of objects from a Parthian-era tomb dating back to between 250 BC and 250 CE. The find was a simple clay jar about the size of a man's fist, but its contents were anything but simple. Inside was a rolled sheet of copper forming a cylinder sealed at the bottom with a disc of the same metal. Through the center of this copper cylinder ran an iron rod, held firmly in place at the top by an asphalt plug, which acted as both a seal and a buffer, ensuring the two metals never touched. To the untrained eye, it looked like a strange religious reliquary or a case for a sacred scroll. But to Wilhelm Koenig, the German director of the National Museum of Iraq who first studied it in depth, it looked like something else entirely. He saw it as an ancient electric battery, a device now famously known as the Baghdad battery. The principle behind this interpretation is shockingly simple and is the same one that powers every disposable battery in your remote control today, an electrochemical reaction. If the jar were to be filled with an acidic or alkaline liquid, something as common as vinegar, wine, or even citrus juice, this humble arrangement of metals would become a basic galvanic cell. The acidic fluid, known as an electrolyte, would react with the two dissimilar metals. The iron rod would act as the anode, surrendering electrons, while the copper cylinder would act as the cathode, receiving them. This movement of electrons is by definition an electric current. The asphalt plug would then serve a brilliant dual purpose. It would hold the metals in place to prevent them from touching and creating a short circuit, and it would allow for a wire or some other conductor to be inserted through it to tap that current. Experiments conducted with replicas of the Baghdad battery have consistently shown that it can indeed produce a low-level voltage between 0.8 and 2 volts, and could have sustained this trickle of power for several days, if not weeks, with a fresh electrolyte. It wouldn't be enough to power a city, but it would be enough to create a genuine, tangible, and undoubtedly magical effect. This leads to the million-dollar question. If it was a battery, what on earth did the Parthians or Sasanians use it for? The most compelling and widely cited theory is electroplating. The process of using an electric current to bond a thin layer of a precious metal, like gold or silver, onto the surface of a less valuable object, like a base metal statue or piece of jewelry. We know for a fact that ancient craftsmen in the region were masters of gilding and silvering objects. The traditional explanation has been that they used mercury to fuse the metals, a dangerous and toxic process. But the use of a rudimentary battery would offer a far simpler, cleaner, and more efficient method. An object to be plated could be connected to the cathode, a piece of gold or silver to the anode, and both submerged in a suitable electrolyte solution. The weak current would slowly draw molecules of the precious metal across the solution to coat the object in a smooth, even layer. This theory is bolstered by the discovery of incredibly fine, microscopically thin gilding on some artifacts from the period, a result that is difficult to achieve with mercury alone but would be perfectly explained by an electrochemical process. Other proposed uses are even more fascinating. Some have suggested a medical application, that the gentle current could have been used for a form of electrotherapy, perhaps to numb pain or treat muscle ailments, a practice that would not be out of place in a world that also used electric eels for therapeutic purposes. Or perhaps the effect was purely mystical. Imagine a priest in a dim temple connecting several of these jars together to create a stronger current and touching two wires to a small statue. A faint spark would leap across the gap, a visible, crackling manifestation of divine power that would leave any witness in awe, a miraculous trick to solidify the authority of the temple. For all its elegant logic, the Baghdad battery hypothesis faces fierce and entirely reasonable skepticism from a large portion of the academic community. The primary objection is a profound lack of contextual evidence. We have found the jars, but we have found none of the ancillary equipment you would expect to find with a technological device. There are no wires, no metal strips that could have been used to connect multiple batteries together into a more powerful series, and no electroplated objects that definitively show the unique signature of an electrochemical process as opposed to a mercury-based one. Furthermore, the asphalt seal is a perfect preservative. If wires made of a perishable material like silk or flax had been inserted through it, their impression might have been preserved, yet no such traces have been found. Skeptics offer compelling alternative explanations for the object. It could have been a sacred storage jar for holding important scrolls made of organic materials like parchment or papyrus. The iron rod would have been the core around which the scroll was rolled. The copper cylinder would have protected it, and the asphalt plug would have sealed the contents from moisture and air, preserving the text inside. The fact that the jars were found in a tomb supports this idea. They could have contained ritual texts or spells meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife, the scrolls themselves having long since decayed away, leaving only the mysterious metal casing behind. The ultimate mystery, then, is not necessarily whether the jar could function as a battery. We know it can, but whether it ever did. If it was indeed a purposeful ancient technology, its disappearance is as significant as its invention. The knowledge would have been confined to a small, specialized guild of artisan priests, a secret so valuable it would have been fiercely guarded. Such fragile, localized knowledge is incredibly vulnerable to the upheavals of history. The Parthian and Sasanian empires were constantly at war with the Roman Empire and later faced the devastating conquests of early Islamic armies. A single invasion, the sacking of a key city, or the death of a few master craftsmen could have been enough to extinguish this spark of understanding completely. The idea would be so far outside the conventional technological paradigm that it would have no framework to survive in. Without a continuous tradition of experimentation and written explanation, the Baghdad battery would become just a curious jar, its true purpose fading into oblivion. It represents a tantalizing possibility of a parallel path of discovery, a road not taken that could have changed the world, leaving us to wonder if the age of electricity truly began not with Volta in 1800, but in a Baghdad workshop 2,000 years before. While the Baghdad battery presents a mystery of a single, forgotten technology, imagine an entire city dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, a bustling metropolis of the mind where thousands of scholars from across the known world gathered to debate, discover, and advance human understanding in every conceivable field. Now imagine that city and everything in it being utterly erased from the face of the earth, its contributions incinerated, its teachers slaughtered, and its very memory all but extinguished. This is not the plot of a fantasy novel. It is the tragic history of some of the medieval world's greatest universities, centers of learning so advanced that their destruction set back human progress for centuries, leaving voids in our collective knowledge that we are still struggling to fill today. Our journey takes us first to the southern coast of Italy, to an institution so old its origins are shrouded in legend. The Scuola Medica Salernitana, the University of Salerno, is often called the world's first medical school. Long before the famous universities of Bologna, Oxford, or Paris were founded, Salerno was a beacon of medical science. Its foundation was mythically attributed to four masters: a Latin, a Greek, a Jew, and an Arab, representing the unique confluence of cultures that made this place so extraordinary. Situated at a crossroads of trade and travel, Salerno synthesized the best medical knowledge from across the Mediterranean. Here, the rigorous humoral theories of ancient Greece, preserved and expanded by Arab physicians like Avicenna and Rhazes, met the practical herbal lore of the local Benedictine monks and the surgical techniques of Italian barbers. The result was a revolutionary, holistic approach to medicine that considered diet, environment, and psychology alongside physical symptoms. The curriculum at Salerno was breathtakingly comprehensive. Its most famous text, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanem, the Salernitan Rule of Health, was a widely copied guide to healthy living that offered advice in accessible verse. But the school was far more than just a purveyor of health tips. It was a place of serious, hands-on study. Unlike many contemporary centers of learning, Salerno allowed for the practical dissection of animals, and it is strongly suggested by some accounts, even human cadavers, granting its students an unparalleled understanding of anatomy. It was also remarkably progressive. The most famous faculty member was a woman, Trocula de Ruggiero, a physician and obstetrician who wrote groundbreaking treatises on women's health that would remain standard texts for 500 years. Her work, De Passionibus Mulierum Curandorum, on the diseases of women, displayed an empathy and clinical precision that was centuries ahead of its time. The loss of Salerno's unique, multicultural, and practical ethos began with the rise of its more theoretical, scholastic rivals in the north, and was finalized when its libraries and facilities were sacked and destroyed by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI in 1194. While its spirit of inquiry eventually spread, its specific, integrated approach to medicine was fragmented and diluted, a loss from which the practice of medicine would take generations to recover. Yet, as profound as the loss of Salerno was, it pales in comparison to the catastrophic destruction of a university that was not just a school, but an entire universe of knowledge. Located in what is now Bihar, India, the Buddhist monastic university of Nalanda was not merely the greatest center of learning in the ancient and medieval world. It was a phenomenon without equal. At its peak in the 7th century under the patronage of the Gupta Empire, Nalanda was an immense residential university, a self-contained city of knowledge that housed over 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers within its walled complex. Its library, known as the Dharmaganya, or Treasury of Truth, was housed in 3 magnificent multi-storied buildings, the Ratnasagara, Ratnadadhi, and Ratnaranjaka, and was so vast it was reputed to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes, making it the single greatest repository of knowledge on the planet. The range of subjects taught at Nalanda was staggering. While its core focus was on Buddhist philosophy, its curriculum extended far into what we would now call the sciences. Scholars here made profound advances in mathematics, including early developments in what would become calculus. They studied astronomy in observatories, accurately calculating the solar year and the movement of celestial bodies. They practiced sophisticated metallurgy and chemistry, creating the high-quality steel used in the famed Delhi Iron Pillar, which stands rust-free to this day. The campus included dedicated schools for medicine, logic, law, linguistics, and the arts. The method of teaching was intensely dialectical, based on rigorous debate and critical inquiry, a process that honed ideas to their finest point. This intellectual powerhouse attracted the brightest minds from across Asia, from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Indonesia, and Central Asia, who spent years, even decades, copying texts and absorbing knowledge to take back to their homelands. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who studied at Nalanda for 5 years in the 7th century, left detailed accounts of its grandeur, its rigorous academic standards, and the profound scholarship of its faculty, whom he described as being of the highest intellectual caliber. This glorious chapter of human achievement met a violent and absolute end in the 12th century. Around 1193, the university was attacked by an army of the Mamluk dynasty under the command of Bakhtiar Khalji, a Turkic military general seeking to expand Islamic rule. Seeing Nalanda as a center of idolatry and infidelity, Khalji's forces ransacked the monastery and university. The libraries containing centuries of accumulated wisdom were set ablaze. The fire is said to have burned for 3 months. Thousands of monks were put to the sword. The great halls, lecture theaters, and stupas were demolished, reduced to the haunting ruins we see today. The destruction was so complete that the very location of Nalanda was forgotten for centuries, only being rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. The loss is almost impossible to quantify. We are not talking about the loss of a few treatises. We are talking about the annihilation of an entire intellectual ecosystem. Whole schools of Buddhist philosophy, known only through the critiques of their rivals, vanished forever. Advanced mathematical and astronomical concepts had to be painfully rediscovered centuries later. Medical techniques and surgical practices were lost to history. The destruction of Nalanda did not just set back Indian or Buddhist knowledge, it set back the entire world, severing a primary artery of human thought and ensuring that the light of the East would take much longer to reach the West. The empty, silent ruins stand as a solemn memorial to the fragility of knowledge itself, a stark warning that the greatest library in the world is only ever one act of violence away from becoming ash and memory. We often picture the medieval world as one of brute force and simple tools, where every task required the direct, straining effort of human or animal muscle. But this image is shattered by a series of incredible manuscripts that reveal a world buzzing with mechanical ingenuity, a realm of automated servants, musical robots, and clockwork palaces that feels centuries ahead of its time. This was not the age of industry, but it was an age of invention, and its greatest minds were designing machines of such sophistication that their sudden disappearance from the technological timeline is a mystery in itself. The undisputed master of this mechanical arts was the 12th century polymath Ismail al-Jazari, a chief engineer in the court of the Artukid sultans in Diyarbakir. In 1206, he completed his magnificent book, the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. This was not a work of abstract theory. It was a detailed, step-by-step DIY guide for craftsmen, filled with intricate illustrations and explanations for 50 separate devices. Al-Jazari's creations were more than just clever toys. They were practical solutions to everyday problems, powered by water, weights, and a profound understanding of hydraulics and kinetics. He designed elaborate water-raising machines, including a magnificent elephant clock that was a full-scale automaton. But his most breathtaking invention was his programmable castle clock, a monumental timepiece that was also a theater of automation. This complex machine featured doors that would open to reveal miniature robotic figures, musicians that would play cymbals, and rotating zodiac signs, all driven by a sophisticated system of gears, levers, and water flows. It was a mechanical computer using a complex array of gears and cams that could be adjusted to account for the varying lengths of daylight throughout the year. This wasn't just telling time, it was performing a mechanical ballet, a spectacle of automation that would not be rivaled in Europe for hundreds of years. Across the Mediterranean, in the drawing halls of European monasteries and cathedrals, a different kind of mechanical dream was taking shape. The 13th century French architect Villard de Honnecourt left behind a portfolio of sketches that is one of the most tantalizing artifacts of the Middle Ages. Among his drawings of church layouts and religious figures are designs for perpetual motion machines, a sawmill powered by water wheels, and an angel that miraculously turns to always face the sun. His most famous mechanical sketch is for a self-operating saw, a device that uses a water wheel to power both the saw blade and the mechanism that feeds the log, creating a fully automated sawmill. Villard's work represents the European strand of this engineering curiosity, a blend of practical mechanics and an almost alchemical desire to harness the hidden forces of nature. While his perpetual motion machines were impossible fantasies, they reveal a mind actively engaging with problems of energy and motion, trying to conceive of a world where machines could work endlessly without human intervention. The knowledge required to bring these visions to life was immense. These inventors were working at the intersection of multiple advanced disciplines. They needed a deep understanding of physics, specifically statics and hydrostatics, to calculate weights, balances, and water pressure. Their work with complex gear trains reveals a sophisticated grasp of mathematics, particularly geometry, to ensure the teeth of their gears meshed perfectly to transfer motion and torque. They were master materials scientists working with precision cast brass, forged iron, carefully seasoned wood, and sealed leather to create components that could withstand stress and friction. Most importantly, they understood the principle of the cam, a simple yet revolutionary piece of engineering that converts rotary motion into linear motion. This is the heart of programming machinery. By shaping a cam in a specific way, you could dictate a sequence of actions. A lever lifts here, pauses there, and drops at a precise moment. This is exactly how Al-Jazari's robotic musicians played their instruments. A rotating cylinder with carefully placed pegs would act as a cam, triggering hammers to strike drums or cymbals in a preordained sequence. They had invented the mechanical programmable computer, so why did this flurry of mechanical brilliance not ignite an industrial revolution in the 1300s? Why did the path to automation seemingly dead end for centuries? The answers are found not in a lack of intelligence, but in the very structure of medieval society. Firstly, there was no economic imperative. Labor was cheap and abundant. The idea of saving human effort through capital-intensive machinery was not a pressing concern for rulers whose wealth was measured in land and subjects, not productive output. The devices of Al-Jazari and Villard de Honnecourt were created as luxurious wonders for the very rich, intended to inspire awe and demonstrate the patron's power and wisdom. They were prestige projects, not engines of industry. Secondly, the knowledge was fragile and isolated. Al-Jazari's work was written in Arabic and remained largely within the Islamic world. Villard's notebook was a unique sketchbook, not a widely distributed textbook. This engineering knowledge was held in isolated pockets, passed down through small, secretive guilds of craftsmen who guarded their techniques as trade secrets. Without a system of widespread publication, education, and collaboration, a breakthrough in one workshop could die with its master. Finally, the materials and precision manufacturing needed to scale these devices simply didn't exist yet. A clockwork angel for a sultan's palace could be painstakingly hand-filed to perfection by a master metalsmith. But building a reliable steam engine requires iron castings of a consistent quality and precision that medieval foundries could not produce. They had the blueprints for automation, but they lacked the industrial infrastructure to build it on a world-changing scale. The mechanical wonders of the medieval world remain a breathtaking glimpse of a road not taken, a testament to a human genius that was forever dreaming of the future, even if the world was not yet ready to follow. For centuries, the story of the Black Death has been one we thought we knew. The narrative is etched into our collective memory, a pandemic born in the steppes of Asia, carried along the Silk Road, and unleashed upon Europe by flea-infested rats scurrying from trading ships in Sicilian harbors. This tale of a rodent-born apocalypse has been the textbook explanation for one of the most devastating events in human history, a plague that wiped out perhaps half of Europe's population in just a handful of years. But what if this foundational story, this medieval nightmare we thought we understood, is fundamentally incomplete? The origin of the Black Death, it turns out, is a cold case that scientists and historians are still urgently trying to crack. with new evidence emerging that challenges everything we thought we knew about how this pandemic began and how it managed to spread with such terrifying, unprecedented speed. The traditional rat-flea model, while elegant in its simplicity, is beginning to show significant cracks under modern scrutiny. The common explanation points to the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which cycles between rodents and the fleas that live on them. An infected rat dies, its fleas jump to a new host, and if that host is a human, the plague is transmitted through a bite. This model works well for explaining isolated, localized outbreaks, but many researchers now argue it struggles to account for the sheer explosive velocity of the Black Death. Contemporary chronicles describe a plague that did not creep from town to town. It seemed to arrive everywhere at once, spreading with a ferocity that feels almost supernatural. In an age without mass transportation, how did the disease move so fast? Rats are not migratory. They are homebodies, rarely traveling far from their nests and food sources. The logistics of an entire continent's rat population simultaneously becoming infected and then spreading the disease in a coordinated wave simply don't add up. Furthermore, the death toll itself is puzzling. While later plague outbreaks killed millions, the mortality rate of the Black Death was in a category of its own, suggesting either a uniquely virulent strain of the bacterium or perhaps a different method of transmission entirely. This is where groundbreaking genetic science has entered the fray, armed with tools that medieval chroniclers could never have imagined. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from the dental pulp of plague victims buried in mass graves across Europe, researchers have confirmed the culprit was indeed Yersinia pestis. But this genetic detective work has also revealed a startling fact. The strain of bacteria that caused the Black Death is the direct ancestor of every major plague strain still circulating in the world today. This means the medieval pandemic was not a dead-end event. It was the Big Bang for all modern plague, a single, catastrophic emergence of a pathogen that has been with us ever since. Yet, this discovery deepens the mystery rather than solving it. If the bacterium is the same, why was the Black Death so much more devastating than its modern counterparts? The answer may lie not in the germ itself, but in how it moved between people. This has led to a compelling and controversial alternative theory, that the Black Death was not primarily a rodent disease, but a pandemic spread through human-to-human transmission via pneumonic plague. When the plague infection reaches the lungs, it becomes pneumonic, and in this form, it can be spread through the air via infected respiratory droplets, much like tuberculosis or influenza. This mode of transmission would account for the terrifying speed and high mortality described in the sources. A person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, and everyone in their household would swiftly follow. It transforms the narrative from a slow wave of dying rats to a suffocating fog of death that could sweep through a crowded market or a cramped household in a matter of hours. Proponents of this theory point to the symptoms emphasized in medieval texts: coughing, spitting blood, and difficulty breathing, all hallmarks of the pneumonic form. This model doesn't necessarily exclude rats and fleas from playing an initial role, but it suggests that once the plague reached human populations, it may have taken on a far more efficient and deadly life of its own. The very geography of the outbreak adds another layer of mystery. The classic narrative places the origin in Central Asia, but pinning down the patient zero moment has proven incredibly difficult. Some researchers are looking further north to a sudden and unexplained collapse of communities in what is now Kyrgyzstan just before the plague reached Europe. Archaeological work there has uncovered burial sites with a stunning spike in deaths around 1338 and 39, and inscriptions on tombstones specifically mention pestilence. Could this have been the ground zero? Others look to the bustling trade routes of the Black Sea, where a Mongol army besieging the Genos trading port of Cathar was said to have catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls, intentionally beginning a biological war that then spread to the fleeing Italian merchants. This story, while dramatic, is now often viewed as apocryphal, a compelling origin myth that may obscure a more complex truth involving the movement of goods, people, and pathogens along interconnected global networks that were far more vast than we often assume. The true origin might not be a single place, but a perfect storm of ecological and social factors that allowed a dormant disease to explode into a world-altering pandemic. The Black Death, therefore, remains one of history's most profound puzzles, a reminder that even our most deeply held stories about the past are always subject to revision, waiting for a new clue to be unearthed or a new gene sequence to be decoded that will force us to see this ancient catastrophe in a completely new light. And so our journey through the shadows of the medieval world comes to a close for now. 30 mysteries, 30 doorways into a past that refuses to be fully known. But this is not a conclusion in the traditional sense, because a true mystery has no end. It is an invitation. What these stories collectively reveal is that history is not a dusty shelf of solved puzzles, but a vibrant, ongoing investigation. Every vanished army, every encrypted manuscript, and every abandoned settlement represents a gap in our grand narrative, a humbling reminder that our understanding of these centuries is built as much upon questions as it is upon answers. These enigmas tell us something profound about the very nature of knowledge itself. They show us that the historical record is incredibly fragile, susceptible to fire, to war, to the slow decay of time, and to the deliberate acts of those who would hide or destroy the truth. The lost library of Ivan, the terrible whispers of how easily a civilization's memory can be buried, while the silent fate of the Roanoke colonists demonstrates how quickly human stories can be scattered to the wind. These are not just historical footnotes, they are stark evidence of the limits of what we can ever truly know, reminding us that the past is a foreign country with vast, uncharted territories. Yet, this uncertainty is not a cause for despair, but the very source of history's enduring fascination. It speaks to a fundamental human desire, the urge to look back, to connect, and to understand the journey that led us here. We are drawn to the Green Children of Woolpit not just to solve a puzzle, but to peer across the dim borderlands of our own reality. We study the Voynich Manuscript not merely to crack a code, but to stand in the presence of a singular, stubborn human mind from 600 years ago and feel the tantalizing frustration of being unable to hear its voice. These mysteries are a form of time travel, offering us a raw, unvarnished encounter with the past in all its bizarre, inexplicable glory. The investigation continues with every new technological advance. LiDAR scans reveal hidden cities beneath jungle canopies. DNA analysis traces the migration of peoples through ancient bones, and satellites pinpoint forgotten ruins from space. The answers to some of these mysteries may yet be found in a dusty archive, in a newly deciphered line of text, or in an archaeological dig yet to be undertaken. The story is never over, and this is where the conversation turns to you. Which of these 30 forgotten mysteries captured your imagination most completely? Was it the chilling, silent fate of the Mary Celeste's medieval predecessors, or the profound intellectual abyss left by the destruction of libraries like Nalanda? Do you have a theory about the princes in the tower, or a fascination with the incredible mechanical dreams of inventors like Al-Jazari? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me which enigma you'd most want to see solved. And beyond this list, what other medieval mysteries haunt your curiosity? The medieval world is deep and wide, and for every mystery we've explored today, there are a dozen more waiting in the wings, each a reminder that the past is alive with questions forever